Welcome to Terrified Tales, where things are about to get unsettling. Before we dive deeper into the darkness, make sure to like and subscribe. Let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. Are you brave enough to be here at night? Now, relax and let the fear take hold. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. The only sounds, the occasional rustle of wind and the distant, erratic cracking of branches. Beneath the dense canopy, the forest seemed to close in on itself, the tree line tightening around the narrow trail. A group of 5 hikers walked in uneasy silence, their feet scraping against the uneven, moss-covered ground. Each of them had come for a different reason, a break from their chaotic lives, a chance to reconnect, or perhaps just an excuse to escape the city's relentless hum. But no one spoke much anymore. The trees, twisted and dark with age, loomed overhead like silent sentinels, their branches groaning in the wind. Jason, the unofficial leader of the group, walked ahead, his pack heavy with the weight of water, snacks, and a map that had begun to curl at the edges. He'd insisted that this hike would be the perfect adventure, an escape to the untouched wilderness. The cabin was supposed to be quaint, rustic, a symbol of peace and serenity. And for the most part, it had been. But now, as the trail narrowed and the sun dipped below the horizon, there was a noticeable change. The deeper they ventured into the forest, the quieter it became. The air grew heavier, almost oppressive, and a low hum buzzed in the back of their ears, the kind of hum that you couldn't quite place, like a static interference. "You sure we're on the right path?" Sarah called from behind him, her voice strained as she pushed her hair out of her face. Jason glanced over his shoulder. "Yeah, we're almost there. It's just up ahead." Her eyes narrowed in skepticism, but she didn't press. Instead, she tugged her jacket tighter around her, the wind growing colder with each passing moment. Behind them, Mark and Rebecca walked side by side, their conversation barely audible against the rustling of leaves. Ben, the quiet one, had fallen behind, his eyes darting nervously between the trees. Every now and then, he would glance up at the darkening sky, a worried frown creasing his brow. "Hey, guys," Ben called out, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Is it just me, or is it getting weird?" The others paused, turning to look at him. He stood a few feet back, peering into the growing shadows, his face pale under the waning light. Jason frowned. "What do you mean, weird?" Ben's voice dropped to a whisper, as if he was afraid something might hear him. "I don't know. It's like the trees are watching us." Rebecca laughed nervously. "You've been reading too many horror stories. There's nothing out here but trees." But even as she spoke, the hairs on the back of Sarah's neck stood on end. She could feel it too, the sense that the forest had grown unnaturally silent, the very air around them thick with a suffocating pressure. She glanced at the others, but none of them seemed to notice. None of them saw the way the shadows shifted in the corners of her vision, or the way the wind seemed to carry voices that weren't there. "Let's just keep moving," Jason urged, a bit too quickly. "We'll be at the cabin soon, and then it's all hot food and warmth." They resumed walking, but the unease lingered like a thick fog, hanging heavy in the air. The path had grown narrower, winding through thick underbrush and twisting tree roots. It was as though the forest was alive, rearranging itself to keep them from finding their way. The trees pressed in from all sides, their gnarled branches twisting like fingers reaching toward them. Finally, they came to a clearing. At the edge of it stood the cabin, weathered and leaning slightly to one side, with a sagging roof and a porch that creaked in the wind. Its windows were dark, but from this distance it almost looked welcoming, like the last relic of an era long gone. It was a far cry from the sterile, modern world they had left behind. The old structure seemed to hum with an energy of its own. The sound of thunder rumbled in the distance, distant at first, but growing louder, closer. Mark turned to Jason. I thought you said there wasn't supposed to be a storm. I didn't check the weather, Jason admitted, his voice tinged with uncertainty. But we should be fine. It's just a little rain. Great, Sarah muttered under her breath. Just what we need. As they made their way toward the cabin, the air grew colder still, and the wind began to pick up, rustling the trees in an unsettling pattern. The first few raindrops fell as they crossed the threshold of the cabin, each drop heavy and cold as it splattered against their skin. By the time they were inside, the rain had intensified, the wind howling as it battered the wooden walls. The door creaked shut behind them, leaving them in a dimly lit entryway, surrounded by the smell of old wood and dust. Well, it's not exactly 5-star, but I'll take it, Mark said, setting down his pack with a thud. At least it's dry. The others didn't answer. Instead, they began to unpack, the sound of zippers and shifting gear the only noise in the otherwise still cabin. The storm outside rattled the windows, making the walls groan and creak, but inside it was relatively calm, despite the heaviness in the air. They took their time settling in, lighting a fire in the old hearth to ward off the cold, but the warmth seemed to have little effect on the strange chill that clung to the cabin. "We should be safe here," Jason said, his voice low, as if he were trying to convince himself. "The storm will pass in a few hours. We just have to ride it out." They all nodded, though none of them seemed convinced. Instead of the comfort that Jason had promised, there was only the steady thrum of the storm outside growing more furious by the minute. The wind howled against the walls like a living thing, its breath cold and filled with an unspoken warning. Just as they were beginning to relax, the first whisper broke through the sound of the storm. It was soft, barely audible at first, and they all dismissed it as the wind. But then it came again, clearer this time, like a voice just on the edge of perception. It was faint, distant, but unmistakably there. Jason. The room fell still. They all looked at each other, eyes wide, in confusion. The wind howled louder outside, but this sound, this whisper, was unlike anything they had heard before. It was as if the storm itself was calling out to them, its voice woven into the gusts of wind. Jason's brow furrowed, but he didn't say anything. He was sure it was just his imagination. The stress of the hike, the storm, the isolation. He was on edge. That was all. But then it happened again. This time the whisper was louder, closer. And this time it wasn't just Jason's name that echoed through the room. It was all of their names. Jason, Sarah, Mark, Rebecca, Ben. The whispers were all around them now, a haunting chant woven into the storm. The hairs on the back of their necks stood on end as they froze, the chill of fear settling deep in their bones. The fire crackled in the hearth, but the warmth it provided felt distant, like a mere illusion against the growing cold that seeped into the very walls of the cabin. "Did you hear that?" Sarah's voice trembled as she looked around, her eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and terror. "It's nothing," Jason replied quickly, though his voice shook. He wanted to believe it was nothing, but deep down something told him it wasn't. And then, as if answering his unspoken thought, the whispers grew louder, closer, and then the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang, sealing them in the cabin with the storm outside, and whatever else was waiting for them. The door, despite its age, had slammed shut with a force that made the walls tremble. It wasn't the wind. Jason could feel it. The air inside had changed, thickening with something unseen, something malevolent. The fire crackled on, its warm glow now seeming like the last thread of sanity holding them together. But as the shadows in the corners stretched longer, the warmth felt colder, more distant. They all stood still, eyes flicking to the door as if expecting it to open of its own accord. But it didn't. It was locked, sealed tight. From the outside, the The storm raged, howling in waves of fury, but the whispers, those soft, unsettling voices, were now louder, more distinct. Jason, Sarah, Mark, Rebecca, Ben. The names were repeated, each one sharp and haunting, echoing from all corners of the room. Yet there was no one there. There was only the presence of the storm, the soft thrum of rain against the roof, and the distant groans of the cabin's wooden frame. Sarah was the first to break the silence. "This isn't funny anymore, Jason," she said, her voice shaking, her wide eyes darting to the others for reassurance. This isn't a joke, right? Someone's playing tricks on us." But Jason could only stare back at her, his face pale, his mind whirling. He wanted to argue, wanted to tell her it was just the storm playing tricks on their senses. But the whispers had a quality to them, a weight, that made everything feel wrong, too wrong. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the storm. Ben had backed into the farthest corner of the room, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. He stared at the window, his wide eyes locked on something just outside the glass. For a moment, he seemed frozen, his body stiff, as if rooted to the spot by some unseen force. "What's wrong?" Mark asked, his voice strained, but the fear in his eyes betrayed him. Ben's voice came out in a whisper, barely audible. "There's someone out there." The others turned toward the window, but when they looked, there was nothing there. Just the rain pouring in torrents, the trees swaying violently in the wind. There was no figure, no movement, nothing except the endless twisting storm. Jason shook his head, his breath coming faster now. "There's no one out there, Ben. It's just the storm." But even as he said it, he felt it, a pressing weight in the room, as if the walls were closing in, the ceiling descending. The air grew colder, and the whispers returned, louder this time, circling around them. Jason, Sarah, Mark. The voices overlapped, rising and falling, each one calling out in a different tone. They were no longer whispers. They were a chorus, a terrifying cacophony, and each name was like a cold hand brushing against their skin. The voices weren't coming from any one direction. They seemed to come from the very walls, the floorboards, the ceiling. "Did you hear that?" Rebecca asked, her voice trembling as she looked at the others. Her face had gone ashen. Her eyes were wild with fear, her hands shaking at her sides. "It's the house," Jason said, trying to steady his breathing. "The wind. It's an old cabin, settling, creaking. That's all." But his words felt hollow, meaningless, as the voices continued their unearthly chorus. Jason tried to convince himself it was nothing, just the house, just the storm. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. The air felt heavy, thick with something ancient, something that had been waiting. Suddenly, the fire in the hearth flickered, casting eerie shadows that stretched unnaturally across the walls. The flames leaped higher, then sputtered and died, leaving only a soft glow. "That's it," Sarah whispered. "I'm leaving. This is insane." But as she reached for the door, it didn't budge. She yanked at the handle, her body straining against the old wood, but it was stuck fast. The storm outside seemed to roar louder, and the window panes rattled as though someone was pressing against them from the other side. "Guys," Mark said, his voice trembling, "there's something wrong with this place. I can feel it. I don't know how, but I can feel it." The others turned to him, their faces pale with fear. The room felt colder now, the shadows deeper. The whispers were now a constant hum, growing louder, swirling in and out of their minds. Each name was repeated over and over until it felt like it was no longer just the wind. It was inside them, inside their thoughts. Ben's eyes darted around, panicked. "I swear I saw something in the window, it—" Before he could finish his sentence, a loud bang echoed from the far corner of the cabin. Everyone froze. the sound so sudden, so violent that it made the floorboards shake beneath them. It had come from the attic. Mark was the first to speak, his voice hoarse. "Did you hear that?" Jason nodded, his pulse quickening. He tried to convince himself that it was nothing, that it was just the storm, the house settling under the pressure of the wind. But the way the walls seemed to groan, the unnatural sound of it, it couldn't just be the wind. The whispers continued, now accompanied by faint, rhythmic tapping, like footsteps in the attic above them. But no one had moved. No one had dared. "We need to leave." "Now," Sarah said, her voice sharp with panic. "I don't care what it is, we're not staying here." But before anyone could respond, the lights flickered once, twice, and then went out entirely, plunging them into darkness. For a moment, all that remained was the noise of the storm outside, and the whispering, so close now, so intimate, that it seemed to crawl beneath their skin. Jason reached for his flashlight, his hand trembling. As he turned it on, the beam of light cut through the dark, illuminating the cabin's cold, empty corners. The shadows twisted unnaturally, like they were alive. Then, through the narrow slit between the boards of the ceiling, something moved, dark, shapeless, and impossibly tall. Jason's heart stopped in his chest. "Guys," he whispered, barely able to get the words out. "Something's up there." The others turned, their eyes wide with fear, but none of them spoke. It was as if the words were caught in their throats, the oppressive atmosphere choking them into silence. The shadows above shifted, a dark figure materializing from the darkness of the attic, its shape indistinct but towering, impossibly large. It had no face, no features, just an empty black void where its head should have been. And then, with a low, guttural growl, it stepped forward, its presence filling the cabin like a suffocating cloud. The whispers crescendoed into a maddening roar, now unmistakably human, pleading, desperate, "Leave, leave now, or you'll never leave." The figure loomed closer, its form slowly becoming more defined with each passing second, the outlines of its long, gnarled limbs stretching unnaturally as it moved. Its body was not solid. It was as if the shadows themselves had taken shape, crawling forward with purpose, and as it reached for them, the whispers grew louder, pressing against their minds, urging them to listen. Jason, Sarah, Ben, Mark, Rebecca. Each name came louder, more insistent, and just as Jason's hand touched the door again, trying desperately to get it open, he heard it. His name, whispered in his ear, soft but clear. Jason. And everything went black. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as the world around him plunged into an oppressive darkness. His breath caught in his throat, trapped in the frozen grip of terror. For a moment he was paralyzed, his body trembling uncontrollably as the weight of the unseen presence pressed in from all sides. The whispers, those voices, still echoed in his mind, louder now, as if they were inside his skull, gnawing at his sanity. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the pressure lifted. He blinked, his eyes adjusting to the faint glow of the flashlight in his hand. The beam wavered, shaking in his grip, as if the light itself was trying to escape. His surroundings were still, too still. There were no more footsteps, no more growls. The oppressive weight of the dark figure was gone. "Guys," his voice was hoarse, barely a whisper as he turned to the others. His flashlight flickered again, casting grotesque, shifting shadows on the walls. The cabin was different now. The air was thick, suffocating, and the temperature had dropped further. His breath fogged in the cold air. The wood of the cabin groaned under the strain of the storm, but the faintest sound, a crack, a shift, came from above. It was the attic. It was as if something was pacing in the dark up there, something far too large to be human. Jason's hand tightened on the flashlight, a bead of sweat trickling down his neck despite the freezing cold. He looked to Sarah, whose eyes were wide, with fear, her lips trembling. Ben stood against the wall, staring at the attic door, his body rigid as if frozen in place. "We have to leave," Sarah said again, her voice shaking with panic. But there was something different in her tone now, something more desperate, like the very idea of leaving had become an impossibility. Mark was the only one who hadn't moved, his face pale and unreadable, staring out of the window into the pouring rain. The storm outside seemed to rage harder now, the wind howling like some predatory creature, its icy breath rattling the panes of glass. But as Jason looked, something seemed wrong. The rain, there was something strange about it. The droplets hit the window with unnatural force, almost as if the sky was throwing them against the glass with purpose. They didn't splatter and run down as they should. They remained on the surface, clustered like tiny black beads, static and unmoving, as if watching them, waiting for something. "Mark, what are you?" Jason began, but his words faltered as he saw Mark's face. It was twisted, contorted with a deep, unsettling fear that sent a chill through Jason's spine. Mark's eyes were locked on something outside, but Jason couldn't follow his gaze. There was nothing out there, only the dark, rolling storm and the endless, suffocating rain. I saw something," Mark whispered, his voice trembling. "In the rain. It was watching us." Jason's breath caught in his throat. The same feeling that had clawed at him earlier, a sense of being watched, was back, heavier now, pressing in from all sides. Suddenly the door to the attic creaked. "Open." Jason froze. He had never heard that sound before, not once. The door had been locked and they had not moved. Yet now it hung ajar, a dark gap in the ceiling above them, an invitation into the void. "Did anyone?" Sarah started, but the question died in her throat. A new sound filled the air, faint at first, but unmistakable. A low, wet whisper, as though something was dragging itself across the wooden floor. The sound echoed from above, slow and deliberate, like a slow crawl of something heavy and unnatural. And then, beneath the dragging sound, Jason heard it. A voice. His name. Jason. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the storm. It was a voice. A voice that he knew. A voice that cut through the haze of fear and made his blood run cold. The voice was distant, as if calling from far away, but it was unmistakably clear, unmistakably familiar. Jason's breath came faster. "Who's there?" The voice didn't respond. But the whispering, those names, each one now individually, distinct, became louder, more urgent. Jason, Ben, Mark, Sarah, Rebecca. The names echoed in the air, and Jason's heart skipped a beat. He turned back to the others. Ben was gone. The spot where he had stood just moments ago was empty now, as if he had never been there at all. His absence was palpable, like a wound, and the realization hit Jason like a physical blow. "Ben?" Sarah cried, her voice rising in panic. She rushed forward, frantically looking around the room, but there was no sign of him. The air felt colder now, the shadows stretching longer, curling around them like the tendrils of some malevolent force. The whispers intensified, a chorus of voices now blending together in a maddening hum. Jason's mind raced. This couldn't be real. Ben couldn't just be gone, could he? His flashlight beam flickered again, illuminating the space in brief flashes of light. As it swept across the room, something caught his eye, something in the corner of the room. A shape, a silhouette. Jason's breath caught in his throat. The shadow was tall, impossibly tall, stretching unnaturally upward, its form flickering in and out of existence like the image of something caught between worlds. The attic door was now wide open, the darkness beyond it thick and impenetrable. And from that dark space, something stepped out. At first, it was just a silhouette, just a shadow against the darkened hallway that led into the attic. But then, slowly, it solidified. It was tall, too tall, its head scraping against the top of the door frame. Its arms were long, impossibly long, reaching down like the limbs of some nightmare. Its skin, what little was visible, was pale, almost translucent, with veins twisted beneath the surface, pulsing like bloodless worms. Jason's heart hammered in his chest, his legs shaking beneath him. But he couldn't look away. He couldn't move. It stepped into the room, its footfalls quiet and deliberate, each one making the floorboards creak and groan, as if the weight of its very presence was too much for the house to bear. The whispers around them grew louder. No longer just names, but frantic, pleading, screaming, "Leave, now, or you'll be lost forever." Jason felt his pulse quicken as the thing, this creature, this shadow, moved forward, its eyes now visible beneath the hooded mass of darkness, glowing with a dull, pale light. It stepped closer, closer still, and the temperature dropped even further. Jason's breath turned to mist in the air. "Ben?" Sarah whimpered, her voice trembling. "Where's Ben?" Jason's mind was spinning. Ben was gone. That much was clear. But this thing, this entity, was here, and it wasn't just some hallucination, it was real. It was in the room with them, moving closer, every step closer, sending the walls closing in around them. Suddenly, the voice, now more distinct, broke through the chaos. "Leave, leave, before it's too late." Jason turned, the last flicker of hope fading. He looked to the window once more, but this time he saw something different. The rain. It wasn't just water. The droplets had stopped falling naturally. They were hanging in mid-air, suspended, swirling around in tight, unnerving patterns. They were watching. And then, one by one, the whispers grew louder, a million voices all speaking at once, and they were all calling for them by name. The air had become stifling, almost suffocating, as if the cabin itself had turned into a trap. Jason's chest tightened with every breath, the oppressive weight of fear pressing down on him like a heavy stone. The shadows now stretched and curled, around the walls, flickering with every heartbeat, alive and pulsing in the dim light of the flashlight. The thing in the doorway, a towering silhouette of darkness, stepped forward, its movements slow, deliberate, as if savoring their terror. Jason could feel his legs quaking beneath him, his mind screaming to run, to break free of this nightmare, but he couldn't move. His body had betrayed him, locked in place by the overwhelming presence of the creature. The whispers in his mind grew louder still, the cacophony of voices now a maddening, endless tide of calls. Jason, Jason, Jason. The name was a hiss, a slithering whisper that dug into his skin like cold needles. It wasn't just a name anymore, it was a demand. His eyes flicked to Sarah, to Mark, to Rebecca, their faces pale and drawn with terror. But none of them seemed to move either. It was as if the very air had solidified around them, trapping them in this nightmarish moment. The creature stepped closer. Its limbs, long, twisted and unnaturally thin, seemed to grow longer with each step, stretching in a grotesque dance of movement. The light from the flashlight caught its skin, and Jason saw it, an unnatural pallor, as if it was made of something other than flesh, something wrong. Its eyes glowed with a sickly pale light. No pupils, just endless orbs of light in the darkness. Sarah, Mark. "Ben?" The voice whispered now, but the tone had changed. It was no longer the wind, no longer the storm. It was something more personal, something familiar. The names weren't being called from outside, from the forest, from the rain. They were coming from inside the walls. The walls themselves groaned, vibrating with a strange resonance, as if the very foundation of the cabin was alive. Jason spun toward the window, his mind struggling to process the chaos around him. The rain, it wasn't rain anymore. It was like thousands of tiny black beads hanging in the air like frozen droplets, suspended unnaturally. They didn't fall. They hovered, clustering in swirling patterns just beyond the window pane, filling the night with an unholy stillness. The rain was watching them. It wasn't just water, it was a presence, an intelligence, something that had taken form, something that knew their names. Jason, the voice was inside his head now, like a thought he couldn't shake. It wasn't just speaking, it was pushing, gnawing at his mind. Come closer. Jason felt his heartbeat quicken, his pulse pounding in his ears. He wanted to run, to escape, but the creature was blocking the door now, standing tall and motionless, like a looming shadow. His flashlight flickered again, casting brief moments of clarity before it drowned once more in the crushing darkness. "Please," Sarah's voice was a desperate whisper, her hand shaking as she reached for him. "We need to leave now," but there was no way out. The window, Jason's eyes locked onto it again, his chest tight with the knowledge that they had no escape. The door was sealed, and the walls seemed to close in on them. The rain outside no longer felt like the storm. It felt like a watcher. And now the whispers were not just in his head, they were in the air, coming from the rain, from the very walls of the cabin. They were inside the house, in the fabric of the building, in the rain. Every drop was a voice, every bead of water hanging just beyond the window was calling to them, "Leave! Leave before it sees you." Jason's stomach churned. The words weren't from any of them. They weren't from the storm. They weren't from the creature. They were from the rain. The sound of the rain tapping against the window was no longer just noise. It was speaking. Sarah gasped, her eyes going wide with recognition. "Oh God. It's not the storm." Jason turned to her, his heart hammering. She was staring at the window with horror, her lips trembling as if trying to form words but finding them stuck in her throat. It was then that Jason noticed it, something he hadn't seen before. Beyond the rain, just at the edge of the forest, there was a figure standing in the distance, tall, still and dark as a shadow. It was watching them. No, it was waiting. And as he watched, the figure raised one long arm, pointing directly at the cabin. And then, slowly, the rain started to fall. But it didn't fall like normal rain. It dropped in thick, slow sheets, each droplet heavy with the weight of something terrible, something far worse than mere water. As each droplet hit the window, it didn't slide down like rain should. No, it hung there like a black bead of tar, sticky and unmoving. Jason's skin crawled as he realized that the rain was reaching inside. The whispers were not just voices. They were touched by the rain, carried by it, as if the storm itself was feeding on their fear, their dread. Suddenly, the attic door slammed, open with a deafening crash, and something moved inside. It wasn't a person. No, not anymore. It was a shadow, stretching impossibly long, its form no longer constrained by the walls of the attic. It twisted, shifting like smoke, and then, in a flash of unnatural speed, it shot down the staircase and into the living room with them. It was on all fours now, the thing. Its face was a grotesque blur of shadows, as if it had never had a face to begin with. Its hands, claws really, scraped across the floor, and its body writhed unnaturally, bending and contorting in a mockery of human movement. The room filled with an overwhelming stench, the smell of decay, rot, something ancient. "Ben?" Sarah cried out, but her voice was lost in the monstrous sound that followed, a low growl that shook the very walls, and then, like a whisper in the wind, the rain changed its tone. It wasn't just the storm now. It wasn't just the wind. The rain, the thing outside, and the creature in the attic, They were all one. It was the same thing, all of it. It had followed them. The storm had always been part of it. The rain, the whispers. It was all the same entity, the same being, the same nightmare. The rain, the storm, the creature was alive. And it was here to take them. Run, Jason managed to rasp, his voice thick with terror. But there was nowhere to run. The windows were sealed, the door locked. The creature was here, inside with them, a manifestation of the storm, a beast born of the shadows. But there was one thing left to do. Jason swallowed hard, his fingers trembling as he reached for the door. It was still locked, still sealed. And, as he pulled at the handle, he heard it again, the whispers. No, not whispers, a scream, not a human scream, but the scream of something ancient, something that had been waiting. And in that scream, Jason understood. It wasn't just the storm, it had always been the rain. The rain had never been an accident. It had been waiting. And now, there was nowhere to hide. Jason's hand froze on the door handle, his heart thrumming in his chest like a trapped animal. He could feel the air around him thickening, suffocating him, as if the very cabin was closing in. The ground beneath his feet trembled ever so slightly, and the faint sound of the creature's claws scraping against the wooden floor above sent a fresh wave of dread crashing through him. The walls seemed to close in tighter now, as though the house itself was shrinking, drawing its breath with a heavy, deliberate pace. Every crack, every creak of the wood felt like it was filled with a presence, an ever-watchful, hungry presence. Jason could feel it, could sense the eyes on him. The thing, the entity, was no longer just in the attic. It was in the air, in the walls, in the rain that pelted the cabin in sheets of cold, suffocating water. The storm had become an extension of it, an omnipotent, unyielding force that wasn't just part of the environment. It was the environment, and it was here to take them. A low rumble echoed outside, deep and unsettling, like a warning. Like the thunder was the growl of some ancient predator. Jason turned back to the others. Mark stood frozen, his back pressed against the wall, his face pale, eyes wide in terror. Sarah clutched her arms to her chest, her breath coming in rapid, shallow gasps, as if the very air was being stolen from her. Rebecca was gone. Jason's stomach twisted. He had heard nothing. Not a scream, not a struggle. Just silence. She had vanished into the storm, like she was swallowed by it, as if the rain had simply taken her. Rebecca. Sarah's voice cracked. She reached for the door, but Jason shook his head, pulling her back. No, he whispered hoarsely. We can't go outside. Not in that storm. But the door seemed to beckon them, the cold night beyond it pulling at their senses like a magnetic force. The storm outside wasn't just a weather event anymore, it was a presence. The whispers came through the walls, through the floorboards, louder now, urgent and desperate, each voice calling their names, pulling at them, trying to lure them into the dark. Leave! The whisper was a plea, a dark temptation. It's coming. It will find you. The rain outside had shifted. It wasn't just cold water anymore. It was like a living thing, beating against the window with a new urgency, faster, more forceful. The beads of water weren't droplets. They were eyes. Eyes, suspended in mid-air, staring, watching, waiting. Thousands of them, swirling in the patterns of the storm. The rain wasn't just the storm. It was the creature, the thing, feeding, off them, pulling them into its gaze. Jason stepped back from the door. We're trapped, he murmured, his voice thick with disbelief. The door had been their only hope, but now it felt like it was part of the trap, like the cabin itself, had turned against them, swallowing them whole. Don't, Sarah whispered. her voice trembling. "Don't let it in." But Jason couldn't help it. His fingers curled around the handle once more. It was like an instinct, a primal urge to break free, to escape the horror that had surrounded them. And then he heard it. A soft sound, almost imperceptible at first, but it was growing louder, closer. The attic door. It opened. A slow creak, and then the heavy thud of something moving above them. Jason's blood ran cold. The thing was coming down, slowly, methodically. It was taking its time, savoring their fear. Each step was deliberate, dragging the weight of the storm with it. His eyes darted to the window. The rain, those eyes, were closer now. One bead of black liquid pressed against the glass, its surface glistening like dark oil. It was watching. Him. Watching all of them. He could feel it, the pressure behind his eyes, the pull in his chest, like his very soul was being drawn toward those eyes. Suddenly, a sound like splintering wood broke through the tension. The attic door cracked open, wider. A shadow moved just beyond the doorway. Not the thing, not yet, but something else. Something smaller. A shape. A figure. Jason's breath caught in his throat. It was Rebecca, but she was wrong. Her body moved, but it wasn't her walking. It was a sickening, jerking motion, her limbs moving at strange angles, her head tilting unnaturally to one side. Her face was hollow, a void of darkness, as if it had been drained of all humanity. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. Only the whispers, her voice, but not her voice, came from within her. A chorus of voices, writhing and tangled like insects, speaking in one voice, one unholy sound. "Jason, leave." Her voice was mangled, like a scream stretched too long. "They'll come for you." Her body jerked forward, but it was too slow, too unnatural. Jason stepped back, heart hammering. Mark screamed, his face pale with horror, but Sarah's face froze in terror. She couldn't look away. The shadow that had been Rebecca's body twisted, her limbs snapping into grotesque angles as the rain outside surged in rhythm with it. The eyes, those endless eyes in the storm, flashed in their periphery, their gaze seeping into the cabin like a cold, suffocating fog. Rebecca's body stopped moving. And then, in the silence that followed, Jason felt the heat of the thing, the creature, staring at him. He turned to face it, heart thundering in his chest. The creature was at the top of the stairs now. He could see it, its face twisting like a mass of black shifting smoke, its mouth gaping wide in an empty, gaping maw. The eyes, the creature's eyes, glowed with the same sickly pallor as the rain. They burned with hunger, with malice. And then the voice. "You cannot leave," it said. Its voice not coming from the creature's mouth, but from everywhere. From the walls, from the floor, from the very air. It echoed through his mind like a final command, a final warning. Jason stepped back, his hand grasping the nearest thing, his flashlight. It flickered weakly, casting long, trembling beams of light against the creature's silhouette. "Why?" Jason forced the word out through his clenched teeth. "Why are you doing this?" This thing, stayed silent for a long moment, its form flickering like smoke. Then it spoke again, this time with an answer that shook him to his core. "Because you let it in. You invited it." The walls groaned as the rain grew louder. The very air seemed to shift with weight, as if the house were holding its breath, and Jason understood. The storm, the rain, the entity, they were all one. And it had always been waiting. Waiting for the perfect moment. Waiting for them to arrive. And now it was waiting for them to die. Jason's chest felt tight. as if his lungs were being squeezed by invisible hands. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the creature now standing at the top of the stairs, its form a dark, shifting mass that seemed to breathe in time with the storm. The whispers swelled in intensity, no longer just voices, but a cacophony, a chorus of rage and hunger that echoed in his mind. The air felt thick, suffocating, and every breath he took felt like it was his last. "Why?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Why are you doing this? We haven't done anything." The thing did not answer. It merely stood there, its shifting mass pulsating with an unnerving rhythm. Its eyes, pale, sickly orbs, shone brighter with each passing second like burning stars in the night sky. And then it moved. Slow at first, its limbs stretching out, long and contorted, until it glided down the stairs with a terrifying fluidity that seemed unnatural, impossible. Jason's heart pounded in his chest. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to escape. But there was nowhere to go. The windows were sealed, the door locked, the walls pressing in with an invisible force. The rain outside had become a living thing, a blanket of cold black liquid that clung to the walls like it was part of them. Rebecca's body, her twisted form, still stood frozen in the center of the room, her face blank, her eyes hollow. The whispers from her throat grew louder, and her head jerked to the side with a sickening crack, her mouth stretching wide. "It's already too late," the voice that had once been Rebecca said, distorted and hollow, as though it came from the very walls of the cabin. "We are already part of it," Jason wanted to scream. He wanted to tell Sarah to run, to do anything to get away from this nightmare. But his voice was trapped in his throat. He felt his mind beginning to break under the weight of the horror, under the pressure of being in the presence of something so far beyond his understanding, so ancient, so malicious, that it had become everything. The creature reached the bottom of the stairs, its eyes locked on him. It raised a hand that was more claw than human, and with a single motion, the air around them seemed to snap. The walls groaned in protest as the rain outside intensified, a torrential deluge that splashed against the cabin's fragile structure. Jason could hear the roar of the wind, but there was something else now, something deeper, more resonant. It was the sound of a heartbeat, a great, primal rhythm that seemed to pulse in time with the storm. It was as if the house itself had a heart, and it was alive, thumping in the dark with the same cadence as the creature's every movement. Mark, still frozen, started to move, but not toward the door. No. He turned toward the windows instead, his expression distant, as if something had taken hold of him, something beyond his will. He stepped forward, walking toward the glass as if hypnotized by the endless flood of rain and the dark shapes moving within it. His fingers pressed against the window, and he stared out into the blackness, his mouth moving in a strange, slow chant. "No!" Sarah screamed, running to pull him back. But it was too late. Mark's body shuddered, and with a loud crack, his fingers pressed harder into the glass, as if his body were merging with the storm itself. His eyes rolled back, and for a moment, Jason saw nothing but the whites of his eyes staring vacantly into the night, and then Mark's body went still. The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the thunder and the unrelenting whispers. For a moment, everything seemed to hold its breath. Jason could feel it. The thing was pulling them in, slowly, piece by piece. First, it had taken Rebecca. Then, it had taken Mark. Soon, it would come for Sarah, for him. But there was one thing he couldn't understand. How? How had they invited this in? The answer came, sudden and brutal, like a slap to his mind. The rain, the storm, the whispers. They had always been here. The thing had always been watching. They had been drawn to the cabin, not by accident, but because it had called to them. The rain was not a storm. It was the creature's essence, its voice, its very soul, seeping through the fabric of the world. And now they were trapped. The creature's form was drawing closer, its black tendrils reaching toward him, toward Sarah, toward everything they had ever known. "Jason," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with raw terror. "What do we do? What can we do?" He looked at her, her eyes wide with desperation, but he had no answer. He had no plan. The storm, the rain, the thing, it was more powerful than anything he could fight. In that moment, Jason understood the true horror of their situation. It wasn't the creature itself. It wasn't the storm. It wasn't even the rain. It was the inevitable. This wasn't just a hunt. This wasn't just some twisted game of cat and mouse. This was a consumption, a slow, agonizing erosion of everything. They were everything they had been. The rain, the storm, the entity. It didn't want to kill them. It didn't want to destroy them. It wanted them to disappear. To become part of it. The creature stretched out its hand, its long fingers brushing the floor with a sound like bone grinding on stone. Jason could hear the cracks, the groans of the wood as the rain outside intensified. The walls, the air, the entire cabin seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the storm, vibrating with something ancient, something that had existed long before they had ever set foot on this cursed land. Sarah reached out, her hand shaking, her face filled with both fear and resolve. She stepped forward toward the creature, and for the briefest moment, Jason saw something in her eyes, something that hadn't been there before, acceptance. And then, the rain began to pour in. The windows cracked, the walls splintered, the glass shattered into 1,000 pieces each. Drop of rain that entered the room now, a black bead of light glistening with cold alien life. The storm had come inside, and as Jason's mind began to crack under the weight of the endless whispers, the voice that had been calling them from the rain spoke soft and sweet. "You belong to me now." And as the walls closed in, as the rain flooded the cabin and the whispers became deafening, Jason realized there was no escape. They were already gone. The rain still fell in relentless sheets, an unbroken torrent of cold black liquid that drowned out every other sound. But in the suffocating silence that followed, Jason felt the echoes of something far worse. A feeling that had seeped into the marrow of his bones, that twisted his mind with a creeping, gnawing dread. He was still alive. But was he truly alive? The world around him had changed, twisted into something otherworldly, something that no longer obeyed the rules of nature. The storm had swallowed the cabin whole, its floodwaters creeping up his legs, up to his waist, to his chest. But it wasn't just water. It wasn't just rain. It was them, the others, the ones who had vanished. Mark, Rebecca. They were in the rain. They were in the walls. They were in the whispers. Jason struggled to breathe. The air felt thick, like it was made of fog and mist, pressing against his lungs, suffocating him. And through the haze of the storm, through the fog of his own disorienting thoughts, he could hear it. The sound of something moving beneath the floorboards. It wasn't just the creature anymore, it was them too. He could feel their presence now, could feel the cold touch of their hands on the back of his neck, on his shoulders. Mark's eyes were open, unblinking, just beyond his reach, watching him. Rebecca's hollow face twisted in the rain, her mouth gaping open, her voice blending with the otherworldly whispers that permeated the room. "Jason," her voice called out to him. But it wasn't Rebecca's voice. It was deeper, darker, like something far older, far more terrible, pushing through her lips. "Jason, you are mine." He wanted to scream, he wanted to run. but his body refused to obey, weighed down by the invisible forces pulling at him from all directions. The storm outside had transformed. The rain was no longer just water. It was a living thing, a sea of eyes, of souls, watching him, waiting for him. The floodwaters rose higher now, swirling with unnatural energy. The whispers in the walls had become deafening, their voices curling around him like the smoke of a fire, filling his mind with an overwhelming sense of loss. Everything he had known, everything he had been, was now slipping away, fading into the endless flood. The thing in the attic was still there, watching, waiting. Its presence loomed, a shadow that stretched from the top of the stairs all the way down into the room. But it wasn't just the creature anymore. It was everything. It was the storm. It was the rain. It was the cabin. It was the world itself. A world that had begun to crumble under its weight. The walls, once sturdy and sure, had begun to warp, bending inward, trembling with the pressure of an unseen force. The shadows, too, had begun to move, stretching unnaturally, twisting into forms that didn't belong. Jason's eyes darted around, his mind struggling to comprehend the horrors unfolding before him. And then he saw it. The door that had once led to the outside world, was gone. There was no way out. The rain, those endless dark eyes, had swallowed the cabin whole. The storm had become it. It had become the world. And Jason was its prey. Air grew colder. The water rose higher. Jason could feel it now, the weight of the creature's gaze, pressing down on him like an iron vice. He turned to Sarah, but she was no longer herself. Her face was pale, her lips moving soundlessly as if caught in some trance. The creature's influence had already seeped into her, twisting her mind, pulling her into the storm. She wasn't fighting anymore. She was a part of it now. The walls groaned, the house shuddered, as if it were alive. And then the whispers began. Again, louder, more desperate, more frantic. "Give yourself to me," they hissed. "Let it in. Become part of the storm." Jason could no longer tell where the voices were coming from. Were they the creatures? Were they Rebecca, Mark, and the others? Or was it the storm itself, the very essence of the entity that had called them here, drawn them into its grasp? "It's too late," the voice whispered, and Jason felt it like a cold hand pressing against his chest. He gasped, struggling to breathe. "You are mine now." He tried to move, tried to run, but his legs felt like lead, his feet sinking deeper into the water that had now completely flooded the room. The rain continued to pour in, the darkness swirling around him like an endless sea of eyes, watching, waiting. He thought of his family, his home, the life he had left behind. But the memories began to fade, like pictures in the rain, becoming indistinct, warped, and lost. And then he heard it, a sound like a scream, a gasp. It was Sarah, but she wasn't screaming in terror. She wasn't even fighting. She was crying. Jason turned, his heart breaking. He had never seen her like this before. Her face, twisted in agony, was staring down at her own reflection in the rising water. The tears that streamed down her face mixed with the rain, the water that rose from the storm. And then the reflection changed. The water began to ripple, distorting, bending like glass. In the shifting surface, Jason saw something that was not Sarah. It was a face he did not recognize, a face twisted in pain, a face marked by something dark and ancient. It was a face from another time, another place. It was the thing, the creature. It was in the water now, its form rising from the depths, stretching towards Sarah with open arms. "Join us," it whispered, its voice soft, seductive. "Come into the storm. Come into the darkness." Sarah reached out, her fingers trembling as they touched the surface of the water. And in that moment, Jason knew. It was too late. There was no escape. The storm had taken them all, and there was nothing left to hold on to. The water rose, swallowing everything. The water was cold, colder than anything Jason had ever felt, colder than ice, colder than the deepest parts of the earth. It filled his mouth, his lungs, drowning him, but not in the way he expected. This wasn't the suffocating weight of water. It was something else. It was as though the water itself was a living entity, a consuming force that reached into his very soul, pulling him into the depths of a place where there was no time, no escape. He could no longer see Sarah. The storm, the rain, the water. It had swallowed her whole, as it had swallowed everything. She was gone, her face disappearing beneath the dark surface. His heart raced, but the terror felt distant, as if it belonged to someone else. The world around him had become a blur, an endless stretch of dark water and shadows. The air was thick with the smell of decay, of something ancient and wrong. He couldn't tell if the storm had passed, or if it was only just beginning. All he could hear now were the whispers, low, guttural, endless whispers that moved through. The air like an electric current filling his mind, twisting his thoughts. And then he saw it. A shape. No, not a shape, but an absence. A void, like a black hole in the fabric of reality itself, standing just beyond the water's reach. The creature. It was larger now, its form stretching far beyond the walls of the cabin, its tendrils creeping out into the storm, into the water. It was everywhere and nowhere, its presence suffocating the very space Jason occupied. The whispers were coming from it now, growing louder, more insistent, until they were all he could hear. You are part of it, part of the storm. The voice that was no longer just Rebecca's said. It reverberated in his skull, 1,000 voices speaking through one. It was always meant to be this way. Jason's vision blurred again, and he felt himself being pulled under, sinking deeper into the water. The cold, dark depths swallowed him whole. His chest burned. He gasped for air, but the surface was so far away. He could feel his body starting to slow, to become numb, but it wasn't from the water. No, the numbness came from something much worse. Something that had begun to crawl beneath his skin, slowly but surely. The creature was inside of him. Its tendrils, like dark threads, slithered into his veins, into his bones, spreading through him like poison, like a virus. He could feel it inside, crawling through every part of him, and all the while the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "You are mine, you belong to me," he wanted to scream, to fight. But the storm, the entity, it had already won. The whispers, the voices, they were no longer coming from the outside. They were inside him, inside his very mind, twisting his thoughts, rewriting his memories. Jason tried to remember something, anything, before it all faded, before everything was lost. He saw flashes of his life, fleeting moments, his mother's laugh, the touch of his brother's hand on his shoulder. But those memories felt far away now, like they were part of someone else's life, someone else's past. Let go. The voice cooed, and Jason felt the last bit of resistance within him crumble. He let himself sink, deeper and deeper into the endless abyss of water. His body grew heavier, colder, his limbs stiffening as the creature's grip tightened, pulling him under. And then the darkness took him. The water was no longer just water. It was the entity, the storm itself, washing over him, filling his mind, his soul. It filled the very space he occupied, the very air that he had once breathed. It wasn't just the end of Jason now. It was the end of everything. The storm had consumed them all. Jason awoke. But it wasn't a normal awakening. It wasn't a return to reality. No, this was something else entirely. He could feel his own body again, but it felt wrong, alien. His fingers, his toes, they were numb, unfeeling. His skin was slick with the cold moisture of the storm, but it didn't seem to cling to him the way it had before. He was no longer in the cabin. He was no longer anywhere he recognized. It was a place of nothingness, void and empty, a landscape made of darkness, with flashes of rain streaking through the black sky. The air was thick, oppressive, and yet strangely still. He couldn't tell if he was standing or lying down. The ground beneath him felt spongy, shifting. It gave way with each step, as if it were alive, breathing, responding to his every move. Whispers surrounded him, not just in the air but in his mind. He could hear the others, Rebecca, Mark, Sarah, all of them, their voices twisted and garbled, lost to the storm. He could feel their presence, not in his flesh, but in the very fabric of his thoughts. "You're here. With us," they whispered, their voices like 1,000 broken mirrors. "You've joined us. Forever." Jason turned, his heart racing. He tried to move, tried to run, but there was no direction, no path. There was only the storm and the endless whispers and the darkness that surrounded him. And then, from the void, something appeared. A figure, no, not a figure, but a presence, a shadow that loomed over him. It was the same thing, the entity, but it wasn't just one being anymore. It had grown, evolved, expanded beyond any physical form. It was the storm. It was the world, and in its depths, in the heart of its darkness, Jason saw something he could not comprehend. A face that was not human, nor any creature he had ever seen. It was a thing made of eyes, thousands of them, blinking and watching, staring back at him with a knowing, malevolent gaze. "This is where you belong," the voice of the entity whispered, reverberating in every corner of his mind. "This is where we all belong. This is where you will never leave." And Jason realized the truth. The storm was not just a force of nature. It was the beginning, the end, and everything in between. It was an eternal cycle of hunger, a ravenous, consuming darkness that had swallowed everything before them and would swallow everything after. And now, he was part of it. Forever. The storm raged on, and Jason was lost within it. The storm had become the world. Jason's limbs felt heavy, as though the darkness of the storm itself had taken root within him, its tendrils coiling around his body, pulling him deeper into the swirling chaos. The wind screamed, its howl a twisted, mournful cry that seemed to pierce his very soul. But it wasn't the wind he feared. No, it was the thing watching him from the dark. It, the storm itself, and the voices that had long since become one with its endless, gnawing presence. He wanted to scream, wanted to fight, but his voice was gone. His mouth opened, but no sound escaped, only the pressure of silence, thick and suffocating, pressing in on him from every side. The face of the entity loomed before him, its 1,000 eyes blinking, turning, shifting, as if all of them could see. Him, watch him, consume him. Its gaze pierced into him like 1,000 knives, tearing apart the last shreds of his will. "You're nothing," the entity whispered, its voice a blend of every voice that had ever been lost to the storm, every voice that had been swallowed. "You are just a memory, one of us, forever." Jason stumbled, feeling the very ground beneath him shift, like the earth was alive, breathing, pulsing with the energy of the storm. The sky overhead twisted, black and purple, like an open wound in the fabric of the world. There was no horizon, no stars, just an infinite stretch of darkness, swirling and churning with unrelenting fury. He blinked, and then he was somewhere else. The sudden shift took him by surprise, like stepping through a door into another reality. The storm was gone. The whispers stopped. The oppressive weight that had been crushing him vanished. For a moment, Jason felt a strange relief. He was standing in what appeared to be the cabin he had once known, though now it was strangely distorted. The walls were cracked, splintered, like the skeleton of a house forgotten by time. A faint, eerie glow illuminated the room, casting long, twisted shadows on the broken floorboards. The windows, once clear, were now dark, streaked with rain that slid down like blood, trailing down to puddles that reflected nothing but the empty room. Jason looked around, disoriented. How could he be here? Was this some kind of twisted dream? Had he awakened from the storm's grip only to find himself in another nightmare? His heart skipped a beat. There, in the corner of the room, stood a figure, no, a shape, hunched and still, just beyond the pool of dim light. Its outline was indistinct, a formless shadow, its edges rippling like smoke. Slowly, Jason took a step forward, his breath shallow, his pulse quickening. The figure moved, not a step, not a sound, but it shifted as if acknowledging him, as if it were aware of his every move. The air in the room grew colder, colder than the rain had been, colder than the deepest night. Jason's chest tightened, his breath coming in quick gasps. He could feel his pulse in his throat, pounding, thundering against the eerie stillness. "You think you're free, Jason?" The voice that came from the figure wasn't the entity's. It was softer, familiar, but no less unsettling. "You think the storm has released you?" Jason's stomach churned. He could barely breathe. His legs shook, and his vision blurred as the figure began to take form, slowly, twisting its limbs into something recognizably human. It was her, Rebecca, but not the Rebecca he remembered. No, this was a version of her twisted by the storm, a hollow reflection of the person she had once been. Her eyes, wide and glassy, were like mirrors, reflecting nothing but the storm's darkness. Her skin was pale, ashen, like the life had been drained from her. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Her face was a silent scream, an image frozen in time. "Rebecca," Jason whispered, his voice breaking through the thick silence. She didn't respond. She couldn't. The words were just a hollow echo of what had once been. The storm had taken her, had taken all of them, and now only the broken remnants remained, reflections, shadows of the people they had been. "Rebecca, what happened?" he asked again, desperate for any kind of answer, any kind of explanation. Her lips parted, her voice coming out in a garbled, strangled whisper. "We are all here." The words tumbled out like a broken chant, incomprehensible, but somehow filled with the weight of a truth Jason could not yet understand. She moved closer, her form becoming more defined, more real, but still wrong, like a thing that shouldn't be. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, as if she were caught between two realities, struggling to hold on to something that had long since slipped away. Jason reached out, trembling. He wanted to shake her, to ask her to explain, to make sense of everything, to tear this nightmare apart, but she stepped back, her eyes widening in what looked like horror. Her body began to crack like porcelain, pieces of her skin flaking away to reveal something darker, something black and writhing beneath. The storm had already taken her, had already consumed her entirely. She wasn't Rebecca anymore. She was a part of it, a part of them. "No!" Jason gasped, stepping backward. He stumbled, his hands scraping against the wall for balance. "No, this isn't real." But as he looked around, the walls began to distort. The room shuddered, the corners bending, stretching. The ceiling cracked, revealing a sky filled with writhing shapes, tendrils, eyes, mouths, all of them stretching downward, pulling the very foundation of the cabin into the abyss below. Jason's heartbeat quickened, but he couldn't move. His feet felt glued to the floor. The shadows danced around him, swirling, closing in like the storm had never left. The walls began to bleed, the dark liquid pooling on the floor, creeping toward him. He looked down at his feet, his breath caught in his throat. The floor was cracking open. The storm's floodwaters were rising again, this time from beneath, the very earth itself bubbling up through the cracks, pulling at his legs. Jason reached down, trying to pull himself free, but the water felt like chains, dragging him deeper into the darkness. And then he heard it again. The whispers, no longer distant, no longer unclear. They were all around him now, curling into his mind, filling it with hunger, with need. They had always been there. The storm had always been here. They were a part of him now. The thing, the entity, it was inside him, in his veins, in his very blood. You're part of it now, Jason. The voice was not Rebecca's. It was the storm's. It was the end. You can never leave. The floor crumbled beneath him, the waters rising faster now, higher, swallowing him whole. And Jason could do nothing but fall, swallowed by the infinite storm that had consumed everything. Jason's body plunged into the darkness, his senses swirling in a disorienting whirlpool of cold, thick water. It filled his mouth, his throat, his lungs. He tried to scream, but no sound came. The flood had overtaken him, pulling him deeper, and yet he wasn't drowning. No, the water was something else. It was alive. It wanted him to swallow him whole, to make him part of it. As it rushed through him, it wasn't just filling his lungs, it was sinking into his very mind, burrowing under his skin, into his thoughts, until he could no longer distinguish where the water ended and his own body began. He felt the pressure, building, crushing his chest, but it wasn't just physical, it was emotional. It was like the weight of all his regrets, all his failures, piling on top of him until he could scarcely breathe, until the suffocating grief in his chest threatened to pull him under for good. The storm was inside him. The whispers, the voices, it was all a part of him now, a collective mass of suffering, endless hunger and pain. He could feel it, coursing through his veins, coiling around his ribs, tightening with every passing second. The air around him was thick, saturated with the faint putrid odor of decay, like something forgotten, something long dead. Jason. The voice was so close, so familiar, but distorted, stretched thin. It felt like Sarah, like Rebecca, like all of them, and none of them at the same time. It was no longer a person. It was the storm itself speaking through them. "Help us," it whispered. "Help us. Escape before you become one of us." The water around him churned, bubbling and rippling as though it were alive, pushing him deeper, pulling him down. His legs kicked desperately, trying to find solid ground, but there was none. The flood was endless. The darkness was infinite. And then he saw it. A shadow, a shape, moving just beneath the surface. Not far away, but not close enough to touch. It was a figure. No, not a figure, but an entity, like something formed from the very essence of the storm, its form shifting with every flicker of lightning, every gust of wind. The thing was watching him. Its eyes, if they could be called that, glowed like shards of broken glass, reflecting the lightning that now crackled through the sky above. There was no face, no shape, just an absence, a hollowing emptiness that screamed nothingness. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, clawing at his mind, tearing through his thoughts. It wasn't just speaking now, it was feeding. "You are part of it," the voice rasped, coming from all directions. "You always have been. You always will be." Jason struggled against the invisible force that held him, his arms flailing, his breath shallow and panicked. He tried to move his feet, but they were stuck, anchored to the abyss beneath him. He realized too late that the floodwater was not just surrounding him, It was saturating his very soul, pulling him deeper into its grasp. And then, like a flash of memory, he saw it. He was standing in the woods again. The cabin was there, distorted, half swallowed by the darkness. He could feel the rain on his face, the weight of the storm pressing against his skin, the whispers curling around him like snakes. He heard Sarah's voice again, her laughter, distant yet close. It was a memory, but it felt so real. Had he been here before? Was this a dream? The voice returned, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was a roar. This is where you belong, Jason. This is where the storm ends, and where it begins. The world around him shuddered, the storm intensifying as the ground began to tremble. The water beneath him rose higher, filling his ears, suffocating him, drowning him in a cacophony of voices. The cabin was gone. The forest was gone. There was no sky, no stars, no earth beneath him, only the storm. Suddenly, his body jerked, as if being yanked forward, pulled toward the center of the darkness. It was the thing, the entity. It was pulling him, and with it, the floodwaters. The whispers echoed through him, not just in his ears, but inside his very mind, tearing apart the last remnants of his resistance. Jason. It was Rebecca again. Her voice was clearer now, more defined, but the words were not comforting. They were filled with sorrow. Please, help me, help us. He turned, trying to see her, but there was nothing. Just the storm, just the black void that seemed to stretch into eternity. The only light now was the crackling bolts of lightning that shattered the sky, illuminating the void for brief seconds before the darkness swallowed it all again. But in that brief light, he saw it. The entity. It was no longer just a shadow, no longer an indistinct shape. Now it was a form, a presence so vast, so terrifying, that Jason's heart stopped in his chest. It was him. The storm had become him. Its eyes, thousands of them, blinked, slowly, methodically, and its mouth opened wide. It didn't have lips. It didn't have a tongue. It was a black hole of nothingness, pulling in everything it saw. Jason's breath caught in his throat. The whispers grew louder, then stopped entirely. Silence. And then a voice that Jason recognized, a voice that was his own. You're here. You're part of it. There's no escape. He screamed, trying to break free of the bonds that held him, trying to claw his way out of the suffocating dark. But it was too late. The storm had already taken him. His limbs went cold, his vision fading. But in the last moments before he sank into the abyss, he heard one final whisper, a whisper that filled him with dread. Welcome home, Jason. Jason opened his eyes, only to find himself staring into an endless void, the kind of void that doesn't just surround you, but consumes you from the inside out. There was no light, no sense of up or down, only an oppressive pressure that crushed. Him on every side, pressing into his very soul. He tried to move, but his body felt as though it was made of stone, frozen, stiff, unyielding. His lungs burned as he gasped for air, but the air was thick, heavy with the weight of the storm. It pressed down on him, suffocating him, pulling him further into the darkness. His heart beat so loudly in his chest that it drowned out everything else, until that was all he could hear, his heartbeat, his breath, the rhythm of his own existence, steady but desperate. Help us. The voice, Rebecca's voice, whispered again, though it seemed farther away now, as though it was drifting through a wall of static or the very storm itself. His body twitched involuntarily, as though the very sound of her name forced a reaction out of him. He tried to focus, to remember who he was, to hold onto the fragment of reality that still clung to him like a fading dream. But it was slipping. His thoughts were slow, clouded. "Help us, Jason." This time it was not Rebecca alone. It was Sarah's voice too. Sarah, lost to the storm. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, tumbling over each other like waves crashing against jagged rocks. And now, Jason could hear more voices, all of them, calling his name. "Jason! Jason!" The voices were maddening. They merged into one. It was no longer possible to tell who was speaking or what they were asking. The storm was inside him, suffocating him, wrapping around his every thought. He couldn't tell where he ended and where the storm began. And then he saw it, a faint glow in the distance, a pinprick of light. He couldn't explain why, but he knew that if he reached it, something would change. He had to move toward it. His limbs felt heavy, sluggish, but he forced them to move. One step, another, slowly, agonizingly slow. He could hear his feet dragging through something wet, something that felt like mud, but it was thick, gelatinous. It clung to his legs as he fought against it, each step pulling him deeper into the mire of the storm's grip. Every motion seemed to take a piece of him with it, like the storm was trying to pull him down again into its depths. And yet, the light in the distance beckoned, soft, glowing like a distant star. Was it a way out? A way home? His heart hammered. In his chest, what was this place? He pushed forward, the storm clawing at his back, the weight of it pressing down on him, threatening to swallow him whole. But still, the light beckoned. Then, it blinked. A sudden flash, so bright it made Jason squint. The world around him shifted, like a canvas tearing at the edges, bending and warping. The air hummed with an almost tangible energy, and Jason felt a sharp pull, something yanked at his core, like the tether of reality was snapping. The storm screamed, Jason's vision blurred, but through the veil of his panic, he could make out the thing, the entity. It was standing at the center of the storm, its form massive and infinite. It wasn't just one thing anymore, it was 1,000 things, 1,000,000 things. Eyes and mouths, limbs and shadows, all bound together in an intricate, grotesque mass of hungry, pulsing energy. Jason froze. The storm was the entity was the storm. It was alive, it was aware, and it had always been there, waiting. "You think you can leave?" The voice came from everywhere, yet nowhere. The voice was everywhere, the entity's voice, echoing through the storm like a dark symphony. "There is no escape. We are one. We are all." Jason tried to back away, his feet stumbling in the muck beneath him. The storm seemed to pull back, a wave of icy wind and water retreating, as though the entity was simply watching him, waiting for him to realize the truth. The truth. Jason's mind reeled, his heart racing as memories flooded him. The cabin, the forest, the storm, the whispers, and then suddenly, it hit him. The storm wasn't just a storm. It wasn't a natural disaster. It wasn't some freak occurrence. It was a manifestation, a curse, a prison, and he was the key. The storm was tied to something inside him. It had always been tied to him. He had wandered too far into the heart of it, too deep into the web of suffering. This storm, this entity, was a reflection of him, his own regrets, his own grief, his own fears made real. It had taken his soul, his life, and twisted it into this nightmarish labyrinth. "You belong to me now, Jason," the voice said again, this time softer, more insistent. "You were always mine. You wanted to find the truth, but now you will become part of it, forever." Jason stumbled backward, panic rising in his chest. He couldn't escape. The storm had already taken too much, but there, on the edge of his thoughts, was the memory of the first day they arrived. The first time he had felt the storm's call, pulling him in, asking him to come closer. He had been naive, had thought he could escape the past, had thought that running away was the answer. But this storm, this entity, it was not an external force. It was tied to the very bones of the earth, to the very soul of the forest. Jason's breath came in short, desperate gasps as the entity began to twist and warp around him. It had no form, no shape. It was all of them, all of their voices, and it was consuming him, swallowing him whole. And then, in a moment of clarity, Jason understood. He wasn't just fighting the storm. He wasn't just fighting the entity. He was fighting himself. The storm was inside him. It always had been. And if he wanted to break free, if he wanted to save what little of himself remained, he would have to face it. Face them. The lost voices. The broken memories. No. Jason whispered, more to himself than anything else. No more. But the storm had already heard, and now the storm was coming for him. The world was collapsing around Jason, folding in on itself like paper caught in an unforgiving gust. He felt his limbs grow heavy, weighed down by the suffocating darkness that seemed to stretch infinitely in every direction. The oppressive weight of the storm closed in around him, but this time, it wasn't just the wind or the rain, it was the voices. They had become deafening, a chorus of whispers that circled his mind like vultures. Each whisper dug deeper, deeper into his thoughts, his memories, his regrets, each one pulling him toward the abyss. It wasn't just the storm anymore, it was his own soul, torn apart, fragmenting like glass. Jason. He turned. The voice wasn't just one now, it was many, all of them. All the people who had been lost, consumed, their lives erased, their spirits swallowed into the maw of the storm. Sarah, Rebecca, his sister, his father, all of them, their voices muffled and distant yet so impossibly close, like a distant memory that had just begun to return only to slip away once more. The storm swirled around him, impossibly vast, and Jason could feel its grip tightening. But in the midst of the chaos, he saw it, there at the center, beyond the swirling vortex of wind and rain, a dim, faint glow, not quite light, not quite shadow. It was the very thing that had beckoned him before. The eye of the storm. The eye. It was still there like a pulse, a heartbeat in the dark, heartbeat in, and Jason knew, with a clarity that was both terrifying and comforting, that it was the answer, the only way to survive. The storm had always been here, hadn't it? Even before the rain started to fall, before the first footsteps in the woods, before the sound of whispers had begun to curl around his mind like smoke. It had been waiting for him, for them, for all who had been foolish enough to come too close. Slowly, painfully, Jason moved forward. The world felt like it was breaking, and each step he took felt like stepping on glass. Each movement a ripple that disturbed the fragile balance between sanity and madness. The water clung to his shoes, to his legs, a thick, soupy sludge that seemed to suck at him, to drag him into its depths, but he had to keep moving. The eye, the heart of the storm, was all that mattered now. He pushed through the torrent, stumbling, fighting against the pull of the storm, and as he came closer, the air grew colder. A deep, unnatural cold that seeped into his bones, numbing him, freezing his very thoughts. The glow at the center of the chaos grew brighter, and with it the voices began to change. They were no longer pleading, no longer whispering. Now they were screaming, the scream of the storm, the scream of something ancient, something that had never truly been alive but had existed in the space between life and death, in the cracks of time and the spaces between breaths. The air was alive now, alive with the terror of those who had been lost, with the soul-shattering knowledge of a truth that Jason had refused to face. You cannot escape, the voice rasped from everywhere. It was everywhere. Inside him, around him, a part of him. Jason closed his eyes, focusing only on the eye, now so close that he could feel its pull. It was both warm and cold, like the pressure before a storm breaks, like the moment when you know something terrible is about to happen. But you can't stop it. The pulse of the eye echoed through his chest, vibrating with an unearthly rhythm. And then something changed. He could hear his name again. This time, it wasn't Sarah. It wasn't Rebecca. It wasn't the lost voices of his past. It was his own voice. Jason. Jason. He opened his eyes, and in the flickering light of the eye, he saw it. A shadow. Not a shadow of a person, but something else. Something that had never been human, never even close to human. It was large, larger than the space it occupied, like an impossible distortion of the world around it. Its body seemed to shift, to bend, as though it existed in multiple dimensions at once. Its form not quite solid, not quite liquid, not quite anything at all. It was the embodiment of the storm itself, twisted and warped, its eyes countless pinpricks of light, watching him with an ancient, knowing gaze. The storm had no form, but it had always been him. Jason's chest tightened. The realization hit him like a wave, washing over him in a terrifying flood of understanding. The storm, the entity, it wasn't just the forest, the rain, the forest spirits, it was him. All the guilt, all the grief, all the hatred he had buried inside himself. The storm was his own darkness, and there was only one way to end it. No more, Jason whispered, trembling. His voice was weak, but it cut through the cacophony of the storm like a knife. I'm not you, the entity laughed, but it wasn't a sound. It was a tremor in the storm, a vibration that rattled the very air, as if it was mocking him, laughing at his feeble attempt to deny what was true. You are me, Jason, it crooned, its voice slithering through the air like a serpent. You are the storm. You are the pain. You are the regret. You are the loss. You cannot escape what you are. Jason shook his head, denying it. He didn't believe it. He couldn't believe it. No, I won't become this. I won't let you take me. But the entity's presence was overwhelming now. It pulsed with power, the wind howling, the water rising, the whispers intensifying, filling his mind. The thing was everywhere, in him, around him, inside him. His chest felt as though it would crack open, his heart beating too fast, too loudly. But then he remembered the light, the eye. There was a way to stop it, a way to sever the bond. To pull himself free, he had to face it. He had to confront the storm within him, with a scream that was part rage, part desperation. Jason plunged toward the eye. The storm screamed in response, a fury so violent it shook the very fabric of reality. The storm wasn't just the storm, it was him. He dove into the eye, into the storm's heart, and everything went black. Jason fell, but there was no ground beneath him. There was no air, no space, no sensation except for the coldness that licked at his skin, biting deeper with every passing second. He felt weightless, suspended in an infinite blackness, a void that pressed into every part of him. His body, though no longer bound by the physical world, still screamed in fear, still felt the pulse of his heart, a frantic rhythm that echoed, distorted in the silence. But the silence was never complete. Beneath it something pulsed, a steady, rhythmic thump like the sound of a heart. Not his heart, the heart of the storm, the heartbeat of the storm. Jason tried to move, tried to reach out for something, anything. His hands grasped at the darkness, but there was nothing there. His feet never touched anything solid. He could no longer tell where his body ended and the void began. And then the voices returned, the whispers. They were distant at first, barely audible. But they were there, like faint echoes from another world. Then, as if drawn by some invisible force, the whispers grew, louder, clearer. They were calling him, pulling at him, dragging him back into the storm. Jason. It was Rebecca's voice again. Soft, haunting, as if it were caught on the wind. The tone was gentle, coaxing, like a mother calling her child. But it held something darker, something more desperate. Jason, help us. But there was no us, was there? No Rebecca, no Sarah, no one. Just voices, shadows of what had been, and remnants of what could never be again. Jason's mind was spinning. He could feel it, feel the storm's energy swirling around him, feeding on his fear, his confusion. The whispers twisted into a sickening cacophony, a choir of lost souls all chanting his name, and then he saw it. A faint glimmer, a flicker of light in the distance, so distant it seemed like a star caught in the infinite void. But it wasn't a star. It was the eye of the storm. It pulsed with a strange rhythmic energy. It beckoned him just as it had before, but this time it was different. It felt like more than just a light. It felt like the center of the storm, the very core of the darkness that had taken hold of him. And now Jason knew what it was. It was the truth. The storm wasn't just alive. It wasn't just a manifestation of his guilt, his grief. The storm was the truth. It was the raw, unfiltered reality of everything he had ever run from, everything he had ever feared. And the eye, it wasn't a way out. It wasn't salvation. It was the final confrontation. His mind raced, torn between the pull of the eye and the whispers that wrapped around him like chains. But the whispers were not his friends. They were not Rebecca. They were the storm, wearing the faces of those he had lost. They wanted him to stay here, to lose himself forever in the cold embrace of their endless void. No, Jason whispered, his voice hoarse, his throat burning as if the very words tore at him. I won't become part of this. But it didn't matter what he said. The storm was not something that could be reasoned with. It was not something that could be controlled. It was an ancient force, a force that had always been there, in the depths of the forest, in the spaces, between the cracks of reality. It had been waiting for Jason, waiting for his fear to grow so great that he would finally succumb to it. And now it was too late. Jason felt a pressure in his chest, a tightening, as if the storm had reached deep inside him and was pulling, tugging at something vital. The pulse of the storm grew louder, faster, until it was all he could hear. His heart matched the rhythm, but it wasn't his heartbeat anymore. It was the storm's. The darkness twisted, shifting around him, and suddenly there was a voice. Not a whisper, not a murmur, but a roar. "You are mine," it said. The words echoed, tearing through the void like thunder. Jason's chest clenched, his body shaking, his vision blurring. He reached out, but there was nothing to grab, nothing to hold onto. The eye was growing larger now, swallowing up the darkness, pulling him closer, dragging him in. His body screamed in protest, but the storm's grip on him was too strong. He had to move. He had to fight. But the words came again, softer now, quieter, as if they were drifting through the cracks of his sanity. Jason. He froze. It was her voice. Rebecca. He could hear her, feel her presence. She was there, standing just beyond the reach of the light, her face glowing softly in the darkness, her eyes wide with fear and sorrow. Jason, she whispered again, reaching for him with a trembling hand. Come back. Please, don't leave me. Don't leave us. The storm's grip on him tightened, as if it were feeding off the weakness in his heart, the lingering fragments of guilt and sorrow that still clung to him. No. Jason gasped, his breath shallow, his chest heaving. No, it's not real. You're not real. But the storm was real, the darkness was real, and she was the storm. The realization hit him like a thunderclap, and in that instant Jason understood. He wasn't fighting to escape the storm. He wasn't trying to outrun it. He wasn't even trying to save himself. He was fighting to save them, to save the ones he had failed, and in doing so, he would have to give himself up. Completely. His body trembled as the storm reached its peak, its energy pulsing violently through his veins. The voices swirled around him, louder now, screaming, wailing in a crescendo of anguish. "Help us!" Jason stepped forward. And in that moment, as the storm closed in around him, he let go. He surrendered. The last thing he heard before the world went silent was Rebecca's voice, clear and final, as though she had always been a part of him. "Thank you." Time unraveled as Jason surrendered, his mind slipping into a deep, endless abyss, where space and thought collided in a chaotic, unrecognizable mass. He could no longer feel his body, no longer feel the weight of his own existence. He was a part of something larger now, something ancient. His breath, once frantic and sharp, had slowed to an unnatural stillness. But beneath the stillness, he felt something, a pulse. It began faintly, like a beat heard in the deepest recesses of his mind. At first, it was hard to discern from the overwhelming roar of the storm. But slowly, it grew stronger, louder, until it was all he could hear. A heartbeat. The storm itself seemed to take on a life of its own, as though it were breathing, living, and he was part of it now, part of its endless hunger. It was no longer just a force of nature, it was him, and he was it. The storm was both a mirror and a prison, reflecting everything he had ever done, every decision, every mistake, and every regret. All the faces of those who had been taken, the ones who had once been part of his world, now danced on the edges of his vision. They flickered in and out of existence, their eyes wide with pleading, their mouths moving soundlessly, begging for release, but Jason couldn't move. His body was trapped in this infinite darkness. His soul, pulled into the heart of the storm, was bound by chains of guilt and fear. He couldn't see them anymore, couldn't feel their presence, except for one. Rebecca's face appeared before him, her pale features illuminated by the dim, eerie glow of the eye, which still pulsed in the distance. She was standing, or perhaps hovering, in front of him, her eyes filled with sorrow and quiet strength. "Jason," she whispered, but it wasn't the pleading voice of before. This was different. This was softer, calmer. She looked at him with understanding, as though she knew exactly what had happened, as though she understood the sacrifice he had made. Her lips parted, but no words came. Jason's mind was a tangle of questions. What is this? What's happening to me? Rebecca's figure seemed to shimmer, her face distorted, the edges of her image bending and shifting like water in a storm. It's not over yet. The pulse grew louder, and for the first time, Jason felt something like pain, sharp, raw, electric, suddenly coursing through him. It wasn't physical. It wasn't something that could be touched. It was inside him, deep, beneath the layers of his memories, behind the walls he had long built to keep it out. "It's not over," Rebecca's voice repeated. But it wasn't just hers. It was the voice of the storm, the voice of all of them, all the lost souls who had been devoured by this place, by this force. Jason reached out, but his arms were heavy, like lead, and there was no solid ground beneath his feet. He could only drift, pulled toward the eye, drawn toward its unnatural pull. And as he approached, he realized the horrible truth. The eye wasn't just the center of the storm. It was the origin. It was the source of everything. The guilt, the fear, the endless cycle of death and rebirth that had kept this place alive, kept this storm going for generations. It had been waiting for him, waiting for the storm to finally claim him, to pull him into the endless cycle of pain and loss that it fed on, and Jason had been its final piece. No. His voice was raw, cracked, barely a whisper as he reached for Rebecca. I don't want this. I can't be part of this. I can't. But the storm pressed on. The eye pulsed faster now, its glow growing brighter, brighter until it swallowed everything else in its blinding light. His mind screamed in protest, but his body was no longer his own. He was part of something much larger, something far older. He was caught in the storm's insatiable hunger. Rebecca's image flickered one last time. Her face was still, calm, resigned. Let it go, Jason, she said, her voice like a memory. Let it all go. And then everything shifted. The world broke apart. Jason felt himself falling endlessly into the eye. The pulse that had been inside him, beating like a heart, suddenly stopped. The storm began to unravel. The chains that had bound him to this place snapped, and he was free. For a moment, there was nothing but the cold emptiness that stretched infinitely, without form, without meaning. But then, like the echo of a distant thought, something returned. The storm that had once consumed him, that had once twisted everything he had ever known, was gone. The eye, that haunting presence, was no more. And in its place, there was only silence. It was a silence that felt heavy, almost unnatural. It pressed against him from all sides like a blanket of cold air, smothering every thought, every sound. There was no storm, no wind, no rain, no whispers, just the quiet. And in that silence, Jason felt something he had never expected. A sense of peace. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he was alone. And then, without warning, a distant, familiar warmth washed over him. It was like sunlight breaking through the darkness, the kind of warmth that settles into your bones after a long, cold night. Rebecca's face reappeared before him, this time not a figure of sorrow, but one of calm, serene acceptance. Her eyes, full of quiet relief, locked onto his. "Thank you," she said, her voice gentle, like the softest breeze. "You freed us." And just as quickly as she had appeared, she faded, disappearing into the silence. Jason didn't reach for her this time. He didn't need to. The storm was over. But as he drifted in the void, the weight of his journey, his sacrifice, settled upon him. This place, this storm, it was never just about him. It wasn't just about the storm that had raged outside the cabin. It was about all of them, the ones who had fallen, the ones who had been lost. It was a cycle, an endless loop that fed on pain, on regret, on guilt. And now, Jason understood. He had ended it, but he had not been the only one. And somewhere, deep in the silence, he could feel it, the faintest pulse of something far, far away. Something that would never truly stop. Something that would always remain, no matter how much time passed, no matter how many lives were lived. The storm was not just a thing of nature. It was a thing of memory, a thing of the past. Jason exhaled, and for the first time he let himself fade into the quiet. You're deep into the story now, and the horrors are only escalating. If you're still with us, don't forget to like and subscribe. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. Who else is staying up late to face this nightmare? Settle in. The terror continues. The world felt different now, like a forgotten dream, uncertain, yet strangely familiar. Jason's existence no longer had shape nor form. He had drifted beyond the physical world, past the storm's terrible memory. The oppressive weight of fear and guilt was gone. The silence around him stretched endlessly, and with it came a strange sensation: freedom. For the first time since his journey had begun, he felt his soul breathe, no longer burdened by the weight of the past. But that peace, fragile, fleeting, was not the end. Somewhere far off, in the vastness of the silence, a whisper rose. A sound so faint it could have been mistaken for a trick of the mind. It fluttered against his consciousness, like the echo of an ancient memory trying to reach the surface of a forgotten ocean. Jason. It was Rebecca's voice again, but softer, different, more distant. Jason's heart, or what was left of, it fluttered. He tried to reach for her, tried to call out, but his voice didn't respond. He could not speak. There was no breath in him, no flesh to give form to his words. Yet the whisper tugged at him, pulling him further from the quiet sanctuary he had just found. The pulse, that rhythmic thrum, began once more, far off, but unmistakable. It was the storm. It had not gone. It had never truly left. Jason felt the air shift around him, though there was no air, no sensation. The boundary between the void and reality was thinning, like the final fragile threads of a dream clinging to the edges of his mind. The storm had been defeated, but it was not vanquished. It could not be destroyed. It was something older than death, something born of grief and loss that had always existed, ever present in the cracks of the universe. It had been waiting for him to cross that final threshold, to release himself from the cycle. But Jason's journey was never meant to end here. The whisper grew stronger, clearer now, though the distance between them seemed endless. Jason. It was not Rebecca this time. The voice was different, but just as familiar. It was Sarah's voice, soft and tender, like a memory of summer. Sarah. Jason's chest tightened. Her name echoed in his mind like the last echo of a dying star, and the realization hit him like a wave crashing against the shore. The storm had not only consumed him, it had consumed them all. His friends, his guilt, his grief, they were still part of this place. Still trapped in the cycle, still waiting. The silence faltered, a crack forming in the stillness. And with that crack came the whispers again, but this time louder, more insistent. Their voices were now layered, a chorus of all the lost, the broken, those who had crossed over into this space between worlds, between memories. The storm was not an entity, it was a memory, a constant, ever-churning cycle of loss, trapped in the heart of the forest, feeding on their souls. And there was no escape. The figures of his friends appeared now, flickering like shadows in the void. First Sarah, her face pale but smiling with eyes full of tears, then Rebecca, then the others, each one trapped in their own form of anguish, frozen between this world and the next. The storm was not over. It was only beginning again. Jason, Sarah's voice called, this time louder, pulling him closer. It's not over. It's never over. And that's when Jason understood. The storm was not just a cycle of fear and guilt. It was the cycle of memory. The storm fed on their pain, on their regrets, on the parts of them that they could never let go. They were all connected now, all wrapped in its endless repeating loop. The storm did not exist to destroy them. It existed to hold them, to keep them bound in this space, to keep the memory alive. Jason was its last piece. And now that he was Here, in this place, there would be no way to leave, not for any of them. Why, Jason whispered, the words barely escaping him. Why did you bring me here? Why did I have to face all of this? Because you were always meant to, Rebecca's voice answered, her figure taking shape beside Sarah's. You couldn't see it before, you couldn't understand it, but we were all lost in the storm, Jason, all of us, and now you will be the one to remember, to hold this place. Jason's eyes widened in horror. His mind spun. He wanted to cry out, but the words wouldn't form. Remember? He gasped. Yes. Rebecca's face softened. You see, Jason, we are all part of the storm, all of us. It's not about escape, it's about acceptance. The storm is always here, in the past, in the future. It feeds on loss, on regret. And now, you are its keeper. Jason shook his head, desperate, confused. No, I don't want this. But the storm he had fought, the storm that had consumed him, was him now. The faces of his friends swirled around him, their voices joining together in a haunting, harmonious crescendo. Let go, Sarah whispered softly, her voice like the last breath of autumn. It's time to let go, Jason. Jason's mind, already unraveling in the grip of the storm's truth, felt his body, his soul, beginning to fade again, to shift. He wanted to fight, to scream, but the whispers came again, pushing him further, pulling him deeper, and then the final realization broke over him. It wasn't that he had failed, it wasn't that he had to be trapped here, it wasn't about being lost or forgotten. Jason had become the storm. He had always been a part of it. Every fear, every ounce of regret. He was the last breath of the forest, the final echo of its cries. And now he would carry its memory, the memory of every life lost to it. He would keep the storm alive, as it had kept him alive. As the silence closed in again, Jason's form began to fade, his physical existence no more than a whisper in the void. And in that whisper, the storm would live on. Time, if it could still be called such a thing, stretched endlessly before Jason. The stillness in the void was profound, an absence so deep it felt like the very concept of existence had become a fleeting notion. He was no longer bound by the rules of the living, but not yet released from the haunting grasp of the storm. His mind was a tempest of memories, echoes of every step he had taken, every face he had seen, every moment that had once felt like now, all merging together in a chaotic swirl, and in the center of it all there was nothing. Only the empty, suffocating quiet. But beneath it all, there was something. A ripple in the quiet, a faint vibration, a pulse that seemed to belong to neither earth nor sky. The storm. Jason had thought the storm was over. He had thought it was just a memory, a tale of lost souls and forgotten places bound to an endless cycle. He had believed that he was free, that by surrendering himself, he had severed the chains that bound him to the storm's insatiable hunger. But freedom was a lie. The storm never left. It only bided its time. It was waiting for him. Jason didn't want to acknowledge it at first. He didn't want to believe it. He had surrendered to it. He had become it. Hadn't that been enough? But as the whisper of the storm began to crescendo, Jason could no longer deny its presence. The pulse inside him grew stronger, thrumming with a dark rhythm, a primal hunger. It was as though the storm's memory had found a new host, a new vessel, him. He could feel it now, pressing against him, wrapping around him like the tendrils of a shadow. The storm had returned. He wasn't sure if he was dreaming or awake, or if, perhaps, such distinctions no longer mattered. But the storm was no longer just a force of nature or a haunting memory. It was alive, and it was growing. As if it could sense his thoughts, the pulse quickened. Jason's body, if that word could even apply to whatever he had become, trembled in response. He felt his own heart, the heart that had ceased beating in the physical world, begin to beat again. But it wasn't his. It was the storm's heart, beating in rhythm with his thoughts, with his pain. And with that rhythm came the realization. The storm wasn't just some malevolent force. It was alive in a way he could not fully comprehend. It had been born from the memories of those who had passed through the forest, the spirits of the lost, and it had grown stronger with each soul it consumed. It was tied to him now, more than ever before. Jason tried to reach out, but the storm's grip only tightened. He wanted to scream, to escape, but there was no voice, no escape. Only the storm and its relentless hunger. Then, through the oppressive silence, a voice emerged, a voice so familiar, so dear, yet so horribly distant. Jason. It was Sarah's voice, soft as if she was standing at the edge of a dream, just out of reach. His heart clenched, the familiar ache of her name flooding his mind. Sarah, he tried to say, but it was a mere whisper, barely a breath. You're still here, aren't you? Sarah's voice echoed, this time coming from every direction. It was not just her. It was all of them. The voices of the lost, the broken, the ones who had fallen victim to the storm's call. It was a chorus of desperate souls reaching for him, for anyone who could listen. You were meant to be the one to remember, Jason. The storm's pulse thrummed in time with his heartbeat, a relentless, rhythmic force that echoed through his very being. No, Jason whispered, his mind a swirling vortex. He could feel the storm growing stronger like a rising tide, its dark influence pushing him further into the void. No, I don't want this. I can't be part of this anymore. You were always part of it, Jason, Sarah said, her voice a distant sigh. You can never escape. You are the keeper now. Jason's breath, or what remained of it, faltered. He didn't want to hear the truth, but it pressed against him relentlessly, like an ocean closing in. You're the storm now, Jason, Sarah continued, her voice now laced with a strange sorrow. All of us, we are all part of it. And so are you. We are the storm. All of us. And then, for the first time since this nightmare had begun, Jason understood. The storm wasn't just a phenomenon. It wasn't just a ghost, a shadow in the forest. It was a cycle of memory, guilt, and grief, passed down from one soul to the next. It fed on loss, on the things we could never let go of, and he had become it. As Jason's mind unraveled further, the storm wrapped itself around his soul, swallowing him whole. There was no longer any distinction between the storm and his own consciousness. He could feel its endless hunger, its insatiable need to grow, to consume, to keep the memory of the lost alive. And Jason was the last one left to carry it, to remember, to suffer. But there was no time for regret, no space for escape. The storm had no mercy, no compassion, and no end. It was not bound by time or place. It was the memory of the forest, the fear of the unknown, the grief of every soul it had claimed. It was eternal. As the storm began to consume him fully, his thoughts started to fade, his memories becoming little more than ripples on the surface of a vast ocean. But through the darkness, one thought remained, flickering like a distant star. Would anyone ever remember him? Would anyone ever know what had happened here? Would anyone ever hear the storm story? Or would it just continue, forgotten, waiting for the next soul to wander too far? Jason didn't know. He didn't know anymore. But the storm did, and it would never stop. The storm's pulse, once a distant throb, now thundering in Jason's chest like an ancient heartbeat, surged into him, consuming his thoughts, his memories, his very essence. It was not a storm of wind and rain anymore. It was a storm of whispers and shadows, of pain and regrets long buried. He was not outside of it, observing it, as he had been before. He was its core, its beginning and its end. The darkness around him wasn't just empty. It was alive, and it felt like the very air had thickened, clinging to his skin. A sense of pressure, as though the universe itself was compressing in on him, tightened around his ribs. The forest, the one that had once seemed so far away, felt closer than ever. It had been waiting for him. It had been waiting for this. Jason tried to move, to break free, but his body didn't respond. Not in the way it used to, anyway. He could feel something stirring inside him, an emptiness, and yet there was also a deep, gnawing connection to the storm, to the forest. The whispers were no longer outside of him. They were now a part of him. He could hear every cry, every call, every name. Jason. The voice was faint at first, a whisper so soft it could have been the wind itself, but it grew louder, closer. It was Sarah again. But this time, it didn't sound like the voice of the girl he had loved. It sounded distant, disembodied, as though she was trapped inside the storm, just as he was. Her voice was joined by others, his friends, the people he had lost, their voices melding together in a chorus of despair. Jason, help us, the voices pleaded. It's not over. You can still save us. But Jason knew now. He knew that nothing could save them. Not him, not anyone. The storm had become them, and they had become the storm. There was no way out. The more the voices spoke, the more Jason could feel himself slipping, his mind faltering. The storm fed on this. It fed on the regret, the guilt, the hopelessness of those trapped within it. And he could feel it all, his own guilt, rising up from the depths of his soul. The faces of his friends, their eyes wide with fear and confusion, their whispers, their cries for help. But all he could do was listen. He had no voice anymore. He was the storm. The forest, so lush and full of life just days ago, now felt like a graveyard. The trees, with their crooked branches, looked like twisted fingers reaching out for something, for someone, their shadows stretching unnaturally long. The ground beneath Jason's feet was no longer solid. It felt soft, like the earth itself was a blanket of decay, holding on to memories, waiting to pull him back down into its depths. And then it came, the storm's whisper, the one that had always been there, lurking in the background. It was a voice, so familiar, yet so strange. It spoke not in words, but in an overwhelming sense of presence, a force that pressed against Jason's mind. "You cannot escape," it murmured, the sound like a caress of cold wind. "You are already home." Jason's heart clenched. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body no longer obeyed him. His mind was a labyrinth of broken memories and half-formed thoughts. And the storm was the only thing that was still real. But then, as the storm's whisper swelled, Jason felt a new sensation, a fleeting but sharp pang of desire that pierced through the dark haze. He couldn't understand it at first, couldn't comprehend the pull. It was a strange sensation, alien to him, but it burned in his chest like a distant star. The desire to break free, to push against the storm, to fight. And then, through the storm's fury, a new voice emerged. A voice Jason had not heard in what felt like forever. "Jason." It was Rebecca. Her voice was distant but somehow clearer than before, not just an echo of a memory but something more tangible. She had always been a force of light, of reason. But this This was different. Her voice, as faint as it was, seemed to cut through the storm's endless noise, like a thread of warmth in the coldest of winters. "Jason, you have to listen. It's not too late." Jason could feel his form trembling as though the very air around him had turned sharp, pressing against him. The whispers, the storm, the disembodied voices, they were all part of him now. But something in Rebecca's voice, something in her words, made him hesitate. "Listen to me." Jason had always believed that it was impossible to break free, that the storm would consume them all, that it was a force of nature that could not be destroyed, only endured. But her words cut through the storm, and for a moment, just a moment, he remembered. He remembered who he had been. The storm, the whispers, the darkness, all of it was born from loss, from grief, from the things that could never be returned. But it was not indestructible. Nothing was, not even this, not even him. The storm had been consuming him for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to hope, to fight, to breathe. But Rebecca's voice was like a spark, a fleeting ember of purpose in the chaos. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to break this cycle. And with that spark came another realization, a terrible one. The storm did not only consume souls. It fed off of them, yes, but it also bound them. The souls that had been lost in the storm, their voices, their memories, their fears, were not just echoes. They were alive in their own way, a part of something larger. And if Jason could hear them, then perhaps there was a way to reach them. "You have to break the cycle," Rebecca's voice urged again, fading but still holding him in its grasp. The storm, Jason realized, was not just a force of nature. It was a prison. A prison that existed in every memory, in every regret. And for those trapped in it, there was no escape unless someone could find a way to sever the link, to break the chain. The pull of the storm grew stronger, urging him to surrender, to fade into nothingness. But something in Jason stirred. The ember in his chest flickered again, brighter this time, the warmth spreading outward. The voices of the lost began to fill him with something new, something unexpected, a strange sense of connection, of unity. He was not alone. They were with him, as lost as he was, but they had not yet given up. And Jason, in that moment, knew what he had to do. The storm might have claimed them all, but it had not yet claimed his soul. Not yet. And so, Jason braced himself. The whispers of the storm swirling around him like 1,000 shadows, like 1,000 fears. But this time he was ready. He would break the storm, break its cycle. And with that thought in his mind, the storm's grip began to loosen, just for a moment, but that moment was all he needed. The storm's voice rumbled, low and guttural, as if it were shaking with fury at the mere idea of resistance. Jason could feel its anger, an ancient rage, primal and deep, thrumming through him, threatening to tear him apart from the inside out. Every whisper, every cry of the lost souls, every scrap of guilt and fear it had consumed, it was him now. The storm had become him, and he had become it. But Rebecca's voice, fading and trembling though it was, had sparked something deep. Within him, a flicker of defiance, a sliver of hope in the crushing dark. Jason's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, fragmented and broken, but one thing remained clear. He would not let the storm consume him completely. Not without a fight, with every ounce of will he could muster. Jason tried to focus, to feel, to reach beyond the confines of the storm's relentless grip. It wasn't just the storm's whispers now. He could feel the souls around him, the ones that had been trapped, lost, consumed, and they were no longer just helpless echoes. They were angry. They were fighting too. He heard them now, louder than ever before. The names, the voices, the faces of the lost souls, all desperately clawing at the edges of the storm, fighting to be free. Rebecca's words echoed in his mind, urging him on. "You have to break the cycle, Jason. You have to set us all free." They were trapped, just like him, but they were still there, still alive in a way. The storm, Jason realized, had not just been a prison for the living. It had kept them alive, but twisted, warped by the endless suffering they had endured. But they hadn't vanished. They hadn't fully succumbed. They were still connected, all of them. And Jason had become the key. His body, if it could still be called a body, trembled with the effort. Every pulse of the storm echoed through his veins, but it wasn't just the storm's fury anymore. It was the resilience of the souls that had been lost, the strength of their pain, their memory, pushing back. Jason breathed, or tried to. There was no real air, no real breath, but he could feel something deep within him stirring. A crack in the storm's perfect, suffocating silence. A crack in himself. "Break it," the souls whispered in unison. "We can't wait forever." The storm responded, its voice a cacophony of rage tearing at Jason's consciousness. It wanted him to surrender. It needed him to surrender. The storm was everything now. He was the storm. The weight of it pressed against him with unbearable force, bending his will, erasing the very concept of self. But Jason didn't break. Not yet. With what little strength remained in his scattered mind, he reached out, not to the storm, not to the shadows that consumed it, but to the voices. They were not just voices, not just victims. They were souls. Souls that had once lived. Souls that still remembered. "Rebecca," Jason whispered into the silence, his voice a frail thread. I won't let it take us. I won't forget." A pulse of light flickered, faint, but there, like a heartbeat against the void. The storm recoiled. The souls, those once lost and broken, surged forward, their whispers transforming into something more. A collective force, a tide of memories and regrets, rose against the storm. They could still feel the world, Jason realized. Even now, trapped in the storm's endless cycle, they knew, they remembered. And that was their power. The pressure on Jason's mind intensified. The storm's voice, more desperate now, howled in rage. "No!" It rumbled, low and threatening. "You cannot break me. You cannot escape." But the voices were louder now, more forceful. They were not just whispers anymore. They were a call, a cry to break free, to break the cycle that had kept them bound for so long. Jason's heart, if it still beat, felt as though it were going to burst. His body, or what remained of it, trembled with the effort. But there was something else, something that rose from deep within him. A will, sharp and relentless. He had never wanted this. He never wanted to be the storm. But the storm had already taken so much, everyone, and it wanted to take him too. But Jason refused to give it that power. He refused to let it take them, the memories, the voices, the strength of the lost. They had fought, and Jason realized, with a horrible clarity, that he had been part of this fight all along. With one last desperate push, Jason reached for the storm, but not to fight it. He didn't need to battle the storm head-on. He needed to break the chain, to sever the connection between the storm and the souls that had been trapped by it. And so, as the storm's fury peaked, as it roared with unimaginable force, Jason let go. He surrendered, but not in the way the storm wanted. He gave nothing to it. Instead, he offered everything. A flood of memories, his own and the storm's, burst forth. They weren't his anymore. They belonged to the forest, to the lost souls that had been swallowed by it. They belonged to everyone, The storm's grip shattered, not in a burst of wind or thunder, but in the complete and utter collapse of its hold. There was no grand explosion, no thunderclap, no crashing of skies. It was quiet. The storm, the cycle, broke. For a moment, everything stood still. Jason opened his eyes, or at least he thought he did. He could feel the presence of the forest again, the weight of the earth beneath his feet, the whisper of wind in the branches above him. The rain, once so thick, so suffocating, was now only a memory, dissipating into the cool air like mist, and then, in the distance, Jason saw something, a figure standing among the trees. It was a familiar face, a face he thought he would never see again. Rebecca. She was standing there, her form flickering in the light of the storm's fading chaos. She smiled, but it was not a smile of joy. It was the smile of someone who had been lost and found again. "You did it, Jason," she said softly, her voice no longer distant. "You broke the cycle." Jason's breath, or what remained of it, caught in his chest. He felt the weight of all the souls that had been freed, the ones who had been waiting, hoping for someone to remember. And now, they were gone, released. The storm was no longer theirs to carry, and neither was it his. But as Rebecca's figure began to fade, as the last remnants of the storm's grip slipped away, Jason realized something that made his heart ache with bitter clarity. It wasn't enough. The storm had been broken, yes. The cycle had ended, but it had come at a cost. Jason had paid the price. He had been the storm, and now he would never be able to forget what it had cost. But in the silence that followed, the quiet that came after the storm, he knew one thing for sure. He had remembered. And in doing so, he had set them free. Even if it meant he would never be free again. The world, once drowned in the chaos of the storm, was now eerily still. Jason stood in the aftermath, surrounded by the silence of the forest that had once felt so alien, so suffocating. The trees, heavy with the weight of rain-soaked memories, swayed gently as if trying to shake off the remnants of what had been. But Jason felt it, the stillness, not as peace, but as a void. A hollow, aching emptiness. He had severed the connection. He had broken the cycle, and yet the world didn't feel as it should. His fingers twitched, still cold, despite the warmth of the dissipating storm. His chest tightened, as if the very air had thickened, pressing down on him. He could hear the rustling of leaves, the faint call of an owl in the distance, but it was all distant, muffled, as though the world itself had been muted. Rebecca was gone. Her form had flickered and faded, like mist in the wind. She had been the last tether. Her smile, her words, her presence had been the final flicker of the storm's power. But now that she was gone, all that was left was the feeling that something had been lost in the breaking. He wasn't sure what time it was. The storm had stolen time itself. The sky, once darkened by thick, swirling clouds, now hung in a sickly twilight. Glow. There was no sun, no moon, just that dim, haunting afterlight. Everything felt suspended, and Jason felt like an echo in this suspended world, unable to hold on to anything. He started to walk, not because he knew where he was going, but because he had to. The urge to move, to escape the weight of the silence, was overwhelming. Each step felt like wading through deep water, his legs heavy, each footfall sending ripples through the air around him. The ground beneath his feet was soft, almost spongy, as though the earth itself was reluctant to hold him. The trees closed in around him, their twisted branches creeping closer with every turn. They looked the same as before, but there was something different about them now. The shapes in the bark, the stretch of their limbs, they seemed to watch him. The air felt thick with their presence. Jason's breath hitched. The storm had ended. It was supposed to be over. But the forest, the trees, the earth itself, they knew what had happened. They knew what Jason had done. They remembered, just as he did. The storm had not been the only thing trapped here. The forest, the land, it had all been bound in that endless loop. The souls, the pain, the storm, it was all tied together, intertwined. Jason stopped. A sharp sound cut through the air, the snap of a twig, loud and sudden in the stillness. He turned, his heart hammering in his chest, but there was nothing. There, just the rustling leaves, the creeping shadows. But Jason knew. He knew something was wrong. He could feel it in the air, like a presence just out of reach, something that shouldn't be here, yet was. And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it, a flicker of movement among the trees. A shadow, tall and unnatural, creeping between the trunks. Jason's breath caught in his throat. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs were frozen in place. It wasn't a person. The shadow was too large, too distorted. It was an echo of something that shouldn't exist, something that had been twisted by the storm, by the cycle. It moved with an unnatural grace, its form shifting as if it were not bound by the laws of the world Jason had known. He took a hesitant step forward. The shadow stopped. For a long moment there was nothing but silence. Then the air around Jason seemed to thicken, and he could hear it, the whisper again. Soft at first, like a breeze brushing against his ear, but then louder, clearer. Jason. It wasn't Rebecca. It wasn't any of the lost souls. The voice, no. The presence felt wrong, foreign. The shadow stretched, twisting unnaturally, until it was no longer just a silhouette. It was defined, its form becoming clearer with every passing second. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to extend far too long for any human shape. The face, if it could be called that, was a mass of shifting darkness, with hollowed, empty eyes that seemed to gaze directly into his soul. Jason's blood ran cold. For the first time since the storm had begun, he felt something deeper than fear. He felt understanding, a dreadful, suffocating understanding. The storm had not been defeated. It had only been contained. The forest, the land, had borne the weight of the storm's agony for too long. And now it had given birth to something new, something worse. The creature, or whatever it was, moved toward him, its eyes fixed on him with a hungry, insatiable gaze. It wasn't just the storm's manifestation. It was something older, something born from the very earth, the twisted. Memories of all who had come before, all who had suffered. It was the legacy of the storm. Jason staggered back, but the creature was too fast. Its form, stretching like smoke, seemed to move through the trees effortlessly, its reach unnaturally long. Jason, the voice whispered again, this time in his ear, cold as ice. We never leave. Not really. Jason's chest tightened. It was as if the forest itself was closing in on him, its limbs reaching, its shadows encroaching, suffocating. His head spun, the edges of his vision blurring. He had thought he had broken the cycle. He had thought the storm had ended. But now, he understood. The storm was not an event. The storm was a state of being. A curse, a wound in the land that would never heal. And it had not been broken. It had simply been passed along. He was not free. The creature, the storm, reached for him, its fingers like tendrils of darkness, its touch colder than the deepest night. Jason's breath was shallow, the air thick, with the scent of wet earth and decay. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. You can't escape. The voice murmured, more sinister now, a promise of eternity. And as Jason's body began to tremble, his mind fractured under the weight of the storm's relentless gaze, he realized one last thing. There was no end to this. There would never be an end. The storm had always been here, and it would never leave. Jason's pulse quickened, his breath shallow as the darkness closed in around him, wrapping him in a suffocating embrace. The creature's tendrils, those long, twisted limbs, stretched toward him with deliberate slowness, as though savoring the moment. The storm's presence was overwhelming, flooding his senses, drowning him in a chorus of whispered voices, the lost, the forgotten, the damned. And still, there was the promise, the quiet, insidious whispering in his ear, the one that spoke of inevitability. You cannot escape. The forest was still, unnaturally so. The wind had died, the rain was gone, but the air was thick with something more oppressive than any storm could bring. The weight of history, of suffering, pressed down on Jason's chest like an invisible hand, crushing him with the enormity of it all. The earth itself seemed to hold its breath. The shadow before him, it was no longer just a form, it was a presence, a vast, writhing mass of darkness, pulsing with an ancient malice. It had taken on shape, yes, but it wasn't just something. It was a force, the manifestation of every wound the land had endured, every soul that had been lost to the storm. Jason's mind raced. It was too much to comprehend, too much to fight. He had broken the cycle once before, hadn't he? He had ended the storm, hadn't he? Or so he thought. The cycle had never been about the storm at all. It had been about them, the souls, the lost ones, trapped in the endless maelstrom. They had been bound to the land, to the forest itself. And now, Jason understood. The storm had been their link to this place. Without it, the land was empty, a shell of what it once was. A void that had been filled with their memories, their agony, and the creature before him, this monstrous thing that had taken form from the very heart of the storm, was the last piece, the lingering remnant of that cycle. It had fed on their pain, their fear, their grief. It had grown strong, grown beyond the storm, beyond the forest. It was no longer just a force of nature. It was something darker, something more dangerous. It had fed long enough, and now it was hungry for its final meal. Jason. The name whispered again, more insistent now. The creature's tendrils reached, for him, its shape distorting, elongating as it closed in. Jason could feel the air grow colder, feel the darkness pressing against him, as if it were trying to consume him whole. The ground beneath his feet shifted. Was it trembling? And he stumbled back, barely managing to keep his footing. The darkness was everywhere now. It was inside him, around him. He could feel it gnawing at the edges of his mind, at the core of his being. It was the storm. The storm wasn't just weather. It wasn't just a storm in the sky, it was the land itself. And Jason was the key. He had always been the key. Jason felt the realization hit him like a blow. The forest had never been about the storm. It had always been about the souls, about the memories they left behind. The storm had been the cage that kept them trapped, that kept the cycle going. But without it, the land would decay, the memories would rot away into nothing. It was the last remnant of something ancient, something that was never meant to be broken. And now the storm's hunger had turned on him. He was no longer just a victim. He was part of the cycle. The creature's dark eyes locked onto his, its hollow gaze drawing him in. The whispers in his mind grew louder, a cacophony of voices screaming at him, calling to him, "Come back, we're waiting." "You can't leave us." Jason's heart pounded against his ribs, the weight of the creature's presence bearing down on him, smothering him. His legs felt like they were turning to stone, his body refusing to move. The tendrils of darkness closed, in tighter, almost lovingly, as if they were pulling him toward an embrace, a suffocating final reunion. You can't escape, Jason, but in the depths of the storm's wrath, its fury, its hunger, Jason felt something stir. It wasn't the voices. It wasn't the creature, it was him, a flicker of resistance, a dying ember of his own soul that refused to be swallowed whole. Rebecca. Her face flashed in his mind, as clear as if she were standing before him. Her voice, her memory, filled his mind with warmth, a light in the dark. She had asked him to break the cycle, to set them free, hadn't he? Hadn't he? Jason's hand shot out, his fingers trembling. His mind screamed at him to move, to fight, but his body refused to listen. He had done everything. He had broken the storm. He had freed the souls, but he was the storm. He always had been. His breath quickened, his chest rising and falling erratically. The creature loomed closer, its eyes glowing with a malevolent hunger. It was pulling him in now, its tendrils curling like snakes, ready to devour him whole. But in the midst of the darkness, Jason heard something. A faint, almost imperceptible sound. A whisper, soft and distant. It was a sound he knew, deep down, the sound of rain, not the storm, not the creature, but the rain, the soft, steady patter of it just on the edge of hearing. The rain had always been a part of the storm. It had always been a veil for the souls, for the voices. But this rain wasn't a harbinger of death. It was a lifeline. Jason reached for it, his mind fighting against the pull of the creature, his heart hammering in his chest. He could feel the weight of the storm, the burden of the lost souls pressing against him, threatening to crush him. But he refused. His fingers grasped the air before him, reaching for the sound of the rain, the sound of release. And just as the creature's tendrils brushed against his skin, something inside Jason snapped. He pulled his hands together, not in submission, but in defiance. The world trembled. There was a crack in the storm, a breaking sound that shattered the dark embrace of the creature. The rain, the real rain, fell, heavy and sudden, washing over him, drowning the darkness. The creature howled, its form writhing in agony as the rain poured down, flooding the forest with a cleansing deluge. Jason's vision blurred with water, but he did not waver. He pushed forward. The rain fell harder, the storm screaming in fury, but Jason held on. And then, with a final, desperate surge, the storm was gone, not defeated, but released. The rain continued to fall, not as an omen, but as a blessing, a mark of something new. The forest was silent again, but this time it was different. The shadows had not swallowed it. The land was free. For now, Jason stood alone, but not in darkness. Not anymore. The forest was quiet, but it was not a peaceful quiet. The air still hummed with a strange energy, a residual pulse from the storm that had just passed. Jason stood alone, drenched to the bone, his heart still pounding in his chest, as if the rhythm of the storm was now a part of him. The rain had stopped, but the world around him felt different. The forest was the same, yes, with its dark, looming trees, but the air felt lighter, less oppressive. It was as though something had been lifted, something that had weighed heavily on the earth for centuries was now gone. But as Jason took a step forward, the ground beneath him trembled, a low, unsettling hum vibrating through the earth. He froze, his feet locked in place. The faintest sound, a whisper, began to rise from the trees. A voice, so faint that it was barely perceptible. It was almost like the wind, but it was not the wind. It was something else. He turned, his eyes scanning the shadows, the dim moonlight, filtering through the branches above. His skin prickled with unease. The storm was gone. It had been broken, but something had followed it. Something had stayed. The whisper grew louder, insistent. And then it became clear. You cannot leave. Jason's blood ran cold. The voice was familiar but distorted, like a memory twisted by time. He took another step back, his heart hammering. Against his ribs. Rebecca. He could feel it now. A presence that stretched beyond the physical. Something was lingering. Something old. Something that had been there long before the storm. Long before the cabin and the cursed forest. Something that had been bound to the land and to the souls that had once roamed it. The land itself had a voice. He could feel it in the air, the pressure, the weight of it. The forest wasn't free. No, it was not a place that could simply be released. It was bound to the cycle, to the suffering that had defined it for centuries. Jason's mind raced. He had broken the storm, hadn't he? The cycle was over. The voices were no longer trapped, but this was something else. Something was stirring. The trees creaked above him, their branches shifting unnaturally, as if they were alive and watching. The ground beneath his feet seemed to breathe. The whispers were growing louder now, intertwining with the sound of the wind. They weren't just speaking to him. They were speaking through him. He's still here, the voice murmured. Jason felt the sudden weight of those words, a truth he didn't want to hear. He couldn't just leave. He couldn't just walk away from what had happened. The storm had changed him, whether he wanted it to or not. The ground shuddered again, but this time it wasn't a distant tremor. It was immediate, and it was real. The earth around him cracked open, splitting apart like an ancient wound that had just been uncovered. Jason stumbled backward, barely managing to catch himself. The forest was alive, and it was angry. The earth groaned, and from the cracks, dark shapes began to emerge. Shadows, hunched and twisted, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Jason's breath caught in his throat as they rose from the earth like specters, their forms blurry, indistinct. But their intent was clear. They were here for him. Jason's heart raced as they drew closer. The air was thick with an unnatural cold, the wind picking up once more, howling through the trees. The shadows circled around him, closing in like vultures. But then, something shifted. The whispers, the voices, everything stopped. The shadows froze in mid-air, suspended in time. The world itself seemed to halt, as if waiting for something. The forest was no longer just an entity of nature. It was a living, breathing force, teetering between the realms of the living and the dead. Jason stood in the eye of the storm. He didn't know what was happening, but he felt it. The overwhelming sense that this wasn't over. The storm had been just a chapter, a single part of something far greater. The cycle had broken, but the Ija echoes of the past still lingered, calling to him. The forest wasn't just cursed, it was alive. The ground shook once more, and the shadows began to move again, their shapes growing clearer, more defined. This time, however, there was something different about them. Their movements were slower, deliberate, as though they were testing the air, waiting for something, waiting for him. Jason's eyes flicked to the ground. The cracks in the earth were widening, and through the darkened fissures, he could see flashes of light, blue like lightning, but it wasn't lightning. It was something more, something ancient. The very heart of the forest was beginning to reveal itself. And that was when Jason understood. The forest, this land, this place, wasn't a place at all. It was a prison. It was a cage, a holding ground for the spirits of the lost, for the echoes of those who had been consumed by the storm, bound to the earth. And now, Jason realized, he wasn't free. The forest was waiting for him to finish what he had started. The storm had never truly been a storm. It had always been this this dark, twisted force that had fed on the souls that wandered into its path. And now that it had been broken, something new was rising. Jason was the final piece, the final key, and the cycle, the true cycle, was only just beginning. Jason could feel the pressure building, the weight of the forest pressing in on him from all sides. The shadows had stopped moving, but they were still there, watching, waiting. The creatures, no longer mere apparitions, were fully formed now, standing at the edges of his vision, their eyes glowing with that same unnatural light. They were like the broken echoes of the storm, remnants of souls long lost, forever bound to the earth. The air was thick with something more than fear. It was guilt. The land had changed in him, had marked him. He was no longer just a man caught in a storm, a survivor of some ancient curse. He was now part of the curse itself. He tried to move, but his feet felt as though they were sinking into the soil. Every step was a struggle, every movement an effort against something invisible, something older than the forest itself. The earth groaned beneath him, a low, mournful sound, like the land itself was lamenting what it had become. Jason glanced around, trying to make sense of what was happening. The cracks in the ground were widening, and from them, the strange, blue light continued to pulse like the heartbeat of the forest. It was in the soil, the air, the water. It was alive in a way that no living thing should be. The shadows moved again, closer this time. One stepped forward, its form taking on a clearer shape. A man, hunched and broken, with hollow eyes and tattered clothes. Its mouth opened, but the sound that came out was not human. It was a chorus of whispers, 1,000 voices speaking in unison. You have come, and you have broken the cycle, but the cycle is not done. Jason's breath caught in his throat. The voice wasn't coming from the creature. It was coming from the very land itself, from the earth beneath his feet. The shadow lifted a hand, and as it did, the ground trembled again. The blue light intensified, glowing brighter, until it felt as if the forest itself was alive, its heart beating with an ancient pulse that resonated deep within Jason's chest. It wasn't just the storm he had broken, it was the very foundation of the land. You cannot run, the shadow's voice whispered. Softer now, but still 1,000 voices speaking through it. The land has you. Jason's eyes widened in horror. His body was already bound to the land, tied to its eternal cycle, to the pain and suffering of those who had been consumed by the storm. There was no escape, not for him, not anymore. The shadow stepped closer, and as it did, the air grew colder. Jason could feel the weight of the forest closing in around him, its roots reaching up from the earth, curling around his legs, pulling him down. His skin felt cold, like it was freezing from the inside out. You have been chosen, the voice continued, the words seeping into his mind, twisting around his thoughts. The storm has marked you, Jason. You cannot escape what you are now. Jason's heart raced. The guilt, the fear, the loss. It was all pouring into him at once. He had broken the storm. He had thought he had freed the souls, but in doing so, he had only broken the last barrier, the last thread holding the land together. And now, the land was calling for him. The shadow reached out a hand, its fingers elongated, tipped with claws that scraped against the air like nails on stone. The ground beneath Jason's feet shifted, as if it were alive, writhing like some great serpent beneath the soil. You belong to the storm, the voice said, its words now a part of Jason's own mind, a part of the pulse in his chest. You are the storm, and the storm will never be free. Jason's body shook with the force of it, the realization of what he had become settling like a heavy weight inside him. The storm had changed him. The forest had changed him. He was bound to It now tethered to the land and the spirits that still roamed it. The cycle was not broken. It had only shifted. The shadow's hand came closer, and Jason could feel the coldness of it creeping into his bones. His breath came in ragged gasps as he struggled against the pull of the earth, against the forces that sought to drag him into the depths. But then, something deep within him, the part of him that still fought, shifted. Rebecca. Her memory burned in his mind, a flash of light in the overwhelming darkness. She had been the reason he had broken the cycle in the first place. She had been the one who had believed that there was a way out, that there was a chance for redemption. He could still change this. He had to. He couldn't let the land take him, couldn't let the storm claim him completely. Jason gritted his teeth, pushing against the force that was pulling at him. The shadows writhed as if they were sensing his resistance, their movements more frantic now. The blue light pulsed, vibrating with a strange ancient rhythm. Jason's hand clenched into a fist, his body straining against the earth. He had been chosen, yes. He had been marked, but he was still Jason, and he would not let the storm swallow him whole. "I am not you," he whispered, his voice raw and shaking. "I will break the cycle." For a moment everything paused. The shadows froze, the ground stopped shifting, the world seemed to hold its breath. And then, without warning, the earth screamed. The forest shook violently, the trees bending under the force of it. The blue light exploded from the cracks in the earth, flooding the landscape in a blinding flash. The creatures, the shadows, they all began to disintegrate, fading into the light, their forms disintegrating like smoke in the wind. But Jason was not done yet. He knew this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. The land had been broken before, and it had always found a way to rise again. This time, though, he would be ready. Jason staggered back, his body weak from the force of the explosion of light that had torn through the earth. The air was thick with the remnants of it, the blue glow now fading, leaving behind a dim, unnatural twilight. The forest stood in eerie stillness, like a tomb. But Jason could feel it beneath the silence, like a heartbeat thumping in the soil, steady, unyielding. The storm had gone. The shadows had dissipated. The forest was quieter now than it had ever been. But Jason knew better than to believe in peace. Peace was fleeting here, fragile as the bones of those lost to the forest's hunger. The land itself, this cursed ancient land, was still waiting. It wasn't over. Not yet. He turned in a slow circle, his eyes scanning the trees, looking for any sign of movement, any flicker of the blue light, any whisper of the voices that had once haunted him. The ground beneath his feet was still vibrating with energy, like the very pulse of the earth was under his control, tethered to his will. The storm might have been broken, but the cycle was not. You are part of it now. The words echoed in his mind again, the voice of the land, of the force that had bound him to it. He could feel it, creeping along the edges of his thoughts, crawling under his skin, whispering its cold promises of eternity. He couldn't escape. Not really. The force that had bound the forest, the storm, the shadows, it wasn't just ancient power. It was a will. A living, breathing thing that had waited for centuries, for millennia, for someone like Jason to arrive. Someone who could break the cycle, who could understand the storm and give it new life. Jason knew what he had to do. His mind raced, reaching back into the memories of the storm, the horrors he had witnessed, the cabin, the whispers, the endless rain, the voices of the lost, the spirits tied to this place. Rebecca, her face, her eyes, her final words before the storm had claimed her. She had believed in him, had trusted him to break the curse. But now Jason understood the truth. The storm had been a prison. It had not been the source of the forest's curse. It had been a part of it, a mechanism, a guard, a cage to hold something far older, far darker. And that darkness had risen again. With each breath, Jason could feel the forest shifting around him, its pulse growing louder. He was standing in the very heart of it now. It was here, this ancient, unyielding will. He could feel it thrumming beneath the surface of his skin. The land had chosen him, and now he was the key to the final binding. He had to choose. The trees, the earth, the wind, they all seemed to beckon him, their dark whispers urging him toward an unknown fate. The shadows, now just fleeting memories of the storm, began to reassemble on the edges of his vision. Torn figures, broken spirits, remnants of those who had perished here before him. "You have broken the chain," the voice echoed again, its words resonating in his chest, vibrating through his bones. "But you cannot leave. You are bound. You must remain to feed the land." Jason's fists clenched at his sides, the weight of the decision pressing down on him like a physical force. He could feel his heartbeat, rapid and erratic, racing in time with the pulses of energy in the air, and then the realization hit him like a wave. The forest wasn't waiting for him to destroy it. It wasn't waiting for him to break it. It was waiting for him to sustain it. The curse would never be over. He couldn't undo what had been done. The land, the storm, the shadows, they were all a part of him now. They had fed on him. They had used him. But he could use them too. Jason stepped forward, a new sense of purpose flooding through him. The air crackled with energy, and he could feel the forest listening to him. The storm had been his last test. He had been chosen to wield the curse, to control it, to turn it into something new. The land wasn't just alive. It was aware, waiting for the one who could bring balance to its terrible hunger. And Jason understood that balance. The curse was not something that could be destroyed. It was something that needed to be controlled. He reached out, his fingers brushing the trunk of a nearby tree, feeling the warmth that radiated from it, a warmth that should not have existed in this cold, twisted place. The land was speaking to him, calling him to embrace it, to become part of it, to feed it with his own spirit. Rebecca, he thought, a sudden wave of sorrow crashing over him. "I'm sorry." He closed his eyes, taking in a deep breath as he allowed the land to pull him in. The shadows gathered around him, their forms becoming clearer, sharper, like the fragments of a dream that was finally taking shape. They were the spirits of the lost, the souls of those who had been taken by the storm and the curse, and now they were his to command. Jason knelt to the earth, feeling the weight of his decision sink deep into his soul. The land was his now. The storm was his. The curse was his. The trees swayed, the earth rumbled beneath him, and the whispers of the spirits surrounded him. The cycle is complete. And as the ground beneath Jason shifted once more, he realized that he was no longer fighting the storm. He was becoming the storm. The whispers faded into silence. Jason's world was no longer his own. The forest, the storm, the land, he was a part of it now, woven into its ancient fabric, like the roots of the trees that twisted deep into the earth. The weight of it was suffocating, the endless hum of energy in the air filling his senses to the brim. He could feel the pulse of the land beneath him, and every beat matched his own heartbeat, a living thing within him, around him, calling him deeper into the darkness. The whispers had gone silent, but they had not left. They hovered at the edge of his thoughts, just beyond the threshold of his awareness. Every step he took through the forest, every move he made, sent ripples through the earth, through the trees, through the shadows. The land watched him, waiting for his next decision, his next command. He was its king, its keeper, and its prisoner. He could feel it in his bones. The storm had been his trial, but now he was its master. His hands trembled as he touched the tree again, this time more intentionally. The bark was warm, alive. The forest itself responded to his touch, the branches above him creaking as if stretching toward him, reaching out. Jason closed his eyes, allowing the sensation to wash over him, to consume him. The land had been waiting for him, for someone to understand its true hunger. And now it had found him. "We are one," the voice whispered through him, not from outside, but from within. "You are the storm, Jason. The storm lives in you, breathes in you." He could feel it now, the storm's heart, pounding in time with his own. It wasn't just wind or rain or lightning. It was a living force, a consuming, relentless energy that surged through the land, through him. Every soul that had ever been claimed by the storm, every life that had been lost to it, was now a part of him. And in that moment, Jason understood the true nature of the curse. The storm wasn't a force to be destroyed or defeated. It was a cycle, a feeding ground for something older than time itself, a cycle that required sustenance, that required pain. The blue light had been the first warning. It had shown him the cracks in the earth, the fissures in the world where the energy had seeped through. It had called to him, pulled him deeper, made him believe that there was a way to break free, to save the spirits trapped here. But it had never been about saving them. The storm was never about salvation. It was about the sustaining of the cycle. Jason's eyes snapped open, and the world around him shifted. The shadows had returned, but they were not the same as before. They were more defined now, figures standing in the gloom, their eyes glowing with the same cold light that had been in the forest since the storm first began. Their faces were pale, their features twisted with a mixture of sorrow and rage. They were the lost ones, the souls who had been consumed by the storm, who had wandered the forest for eternity, unable to find rest. But now they were waiting for something. For him. Jason took a step forward, his feet moving with a strange purpose. The forest was no longer a place of terror. It was his kingdom. His fingers twitched, and the shadows responded. The spirits, the lost, moved with him, following his lead. He was no longer an outsider here. He had become the storm's core. "You will lead them," the voice spoke again, this time softer, as though it were coaxing him. "They are bound to you, now. You are their king." Jason's heart thundered in his chest as he stood at the edge of the clearing, his eyes sweeping over the vast expanse of trees, their twisted branches reaching up like skeletal hands. The storm was not gone. It had only changed. The land was feeding on him now, and he, in turn, was feeding it. The cycle was complete. He turned to the shadows that flanked him, dozens of them, maybe more, all watching him with the same hollow, yearning gaze. The spirits were no longer trapped in the storm. They were free, free to follow him, to be led by him into the next phase of their existence. But Jason knew that freedom was an illusion. They were still bound to the land, just as he was. And now he had to choose what came next. Jason closed, his eyes again, taking a long, steadying breath. His mind raced. He could feel the weight of the land pressing down on him, like 1,000 souls all clamoring for his attention. The storm was not over. It had simply shifted, changed its shape, its form, and now he was its keeper, its master, but he was also its servant. He opened his eyes, and for the first time since the storm had begun, he felt something shift within him. There was no longer any fear, no longer any resistance. He had become the storm. He had become the force that had torn through this land and destroyed so many before him. And he would continue that legacy. his legacy. The spirits were silent now, waiting for him to act, to lead them. The trees groaned as if they were waiting too, the roots shifting beneath the soil. Jason raised his arms to the sky. His voice was low, commanding. Let it begin again. And the storm responded. The sky darkened once more, and the winds began to howl. The ground trembled beneath him, and the trees began to sway, their branches creaking as the storm returned, in full force. The rain began to fall in sheets, and the thunder rolled across the horizon. The air crackled with energy, the very earth vibrating with the power of it. Jason could feel it. The storm was alive, and it was feeding, and he was its heart. The sky was nothing but a swirling black mass, as if the heavens themselves were being torn apart by the force that Jason had summoned. The wind howled through the trees, ripping branches from their trunks, sending them crashing to the earth. The rain lashed against the ground like cold daggers, and the thunder that had once seemed distant now roared with a deafening fury. Jason stood at the center of it all, his arms raised high to the sky, his eyes glowing with the blue fire that had once consumed him. The storm had become a part of him, a living force pulsing in his veins. The land was his to command. The whispers of the lost souls, those who had wandered this cursed forest, those who had fed the storm for centuries, echoed in his mind, urging him onward. You are the storm. You are the cycle. But even as he stood there, reveling in the power that surged through him, something inside him began to crack. The forest, the storm, the whispers. They had promised him control. They had promised him mastery over the land. But what they had not warned him about was the cost of being the storm, the weight of the spirits, the weight of the curse. He could feel it now, pressing down on him, suffocating him. The land was hungry, always hungry, and it was feeding off him. Every breath he took, every heartbeat, was just another offering to the storm. Jason's body trembled, the power that flowed through him now feeling less like strength and more like a prison. The storm had become a part of him, yes, but now it had consumed him in a way he had not anticipated. He was bound to it, bound to the curse, and there was no escape. This is your fate, Jason. You will lead them. Forever. The voice, the one that had once guided him, now seemed hollow, distant, as though it too was growing weary of the endless cycle. Jason's vision blurred, and he staggered, his knees buckling beneath him. He fell to the ground, the mud and rain mixing with the blood that stained his clothes. He could feel the storm pressing in, the energy of it building higher and higher, like a crescendo in a symphony. It wanted something from him. It wanted his very soul. He clenched his fists into the wet earth, his nails digging into the soil. I can't let it end like this, he thought. I can't be this thing, I can't. And then it came to him. The realization. He had thought that breaking the cycle meant destroying the storm, but the storm wasn't something that could be destroyed. The storm was life. It was a force of nature, a primal energy, one that had existed long before humanity had ever set foot on this cursed land. It was tied to the earth, to the sky, to everything, and no one could escape it, not even him. But there was one thing he could do, one thing he had not yet tried. Jason closed his eyes and focused on the pulse of the land beneath him, the hum of the earth vibrating in his chest. He could feel it, feel the storm's heart, its endless, unyielding hunger. He could feel the souls of the lost, their cries echoing in his mind, their desperation for release. They had been trapped here, bound to the land, to the storm. They were his responsibility now. And so, with every ounce of his will, Jason did the only thing he could think to do. He reached deep inside himself, deep into the storm, deep into the very heart of the curse. And he let go. The land trembled. The sky cracked open with a deafening thunderclap, and for a brief, fleeting moment, the storm seemed to pause, to hold its breath. Jason felt his body convulse as the energy around him surged and then dissipated in a single, shuddering wave. The whispers stopped. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was silence. Jason collapsed to the ground, his arms falling, limply at his sides. The storm raged on around him, but now it was different. It was distant. The weight of the curse had lifted from his shoulders, and though the storm continued to howl in the skies above, it no longer had a hold on him. In a small village, a cat named Whiskers discovered a magic fish in a pond. The fish promised 3 wishes in exchange for its freedom. Whiskers wished for endless fish, a cozy bed, and a bell that rang softly. The fish granted all 3 wishes and swam away, leaving Whiskers content and purring in the sun. The rain began to soften, no longer a violent downpour, but a steady, gentle fall. The thunder, once deafening, now rolled in the distance like a memory fading away. The wind was no longer a force of destruction, but a cool breeze that whispered through the trees, as though the forest itself was breathing for the first time in centuries. Jason lay there, chest heaving, heart pounding in his ears. The energy that had once surged through him was now gone, leaving only the quiet remnants of the storm behind. And then he heard it. The softest of whispers, barely audible over the rain. "Thank you." It was a voice, a single voice among the thousands that had once cried out in torment. It was Rebecca's voice. Jason's heart twisted in his chest as he sat up, his hands trembling. For the first time in what felt like forever, he could breathe. The land was still cursed, the storm still raged, but Jason had broken its hold on him. And in doing so, he had freed the spirits, the souls that had been trapped here. The cycle, it seemed, had not been broken, but it had been changed. Jason rose to his feet, his eyes lifting to the sky. The storm was still there, still a force of nature. But now, it was not his burden to bear. The voices had quieted. The storm had quieted. And as Jason turned to leave the clearing, he understood the truth. He was no longer a part of the curse. He had walked through the storm. He had survived, but now the land would feed on others. Always others. And as he disappeared into the trees, the faintest, saddest whisper reached his ears. The storm will always need its heart, and Jason knew as he walked away that he would never truly escape the forest, the land, or the storm. It would always be with him, pulsing beneath his skin, a silent, endless hunger that would never let him go. The cycle would continue, but for now he was free.